In this video, we're going to break down every level of the South Park iceberg, from the surface-level controversial moments to the genuinely traumatic and philosophically disturbing lore hidden beneath. Let's get started. First, Scott Tenorman Must Die represents one of South Park's most pivotal transformations, where Eric Cartman's vindictive nature escalates from schoolyard bullying into premeditated psychological torture that crosses into genuine horror territory. This Season 5 episode takes a simple revenge plot and transforms it into a case study of calculated cruelty that permanently altered the series' tonal boundaries. When Scott Tenorman, a ninth grader, tricks Cartman into buying his pubic hair for $10, the resulting humiliation triggers a response that goes far beyond proportional retaliation into methodically planned psychological destruction. The setup begins with typical South Park crude humor as Cartman realizes he's been scammed and becomes the laughingstock of his peers. His initial revenge attempts follow predictable patterns of escalating pranks and schemes that fail repeatedly, creating the impression of standard cartoon conflict where characters engage in back-and-forth retaliation without lasting consequences. These early failures serve dual purposes, establishing Scott's superior intelligence while masking Cartman's true strategic capacity. Each failed attempt makes Scott more confident and Cartman more publicly humiliated, building what appears to be a narrative about a bully receiving comeuppance from his intellectual superior. The methodical planning phase reveals Cartman's capacity for long-term strategic thinking that surpasses typical childhood vindictiveness. He doesn't simply react emotionally, but constructs an elaborate revenge scheme spanning multiple stages, each designed to manipulate Scott's psychology while appearing innocuous. The plan involves training a pony to bite off Scott's penis, stealing his parents' corpses after orchestrating their deaths, grinding the bodies into chili, and serving that chili to Scott at a public event where his emotional breakdown becomes entertainment. The complexity demonstrates not impulsive anger, but calculating malice that requires sustained focus, multiple coordinated actions, and psychological insight into how to maximize suffering. The execution phase shows Cartman manipulating every element with precision that suggests genuine psychopathic tendencies rather than cartoon villainy. He convinces Scott's parents to travel to a specific location by creating a false conflict with a farmer whose land they need to cross. He times their arrival to coincide with a moment when he can startle their horse, causing it to kick them into an active thresher. The mechanical nature of the deaths creates distance that allows Cartman to proceed without confronting the visceral reality of what he's done. He then retrieves the bodies, processes them into meat, and prepares the chili with apparent emotional detachment. The reveal sequence represents perhaps the darkest moment in animated television history through its methodical psychological torture. Cartman organizes a chili contest with Scott as guest of honor, creating a public setting that prevents Scott from processing his trauma privately. As Scott consumes the chili, Cartman builds tension through hints and innuendo before playing a video that reveals Scott's parents are dead. The revelation doesn't come through direct statement, but through visual evidence that forces Scott to reconstruct events himself, making him an active participant in understanding his own trauma rather than a passive recipient of bad news. The psychological devastation manifests through Scott's complete emotional breakdown as he realizes he's been eating his own parents. His response shows genuine trauma rather than cartoon exaggeration, with hysterical crying, vomiting, and collapse that reflects realistic psychological shattering. The show depicts his breakdown with unusual seriousness, allowing the moment to play without undercutting it with jokes or rapid scene changes. The extended duration of his suffering creates discomfort that forces viewers to confront what Cartman has actually done, rather than allowing distance through comedic framing. Radiohead's presence serves as witness to Cartman's triumph while highlighting the complete innocence of Scott's suffering. The band appears because Cartman arranged for them to attend, using them as additional psychological weapon by having Scott's idols watch his humiliation. Their reactions of disgust and mockery compound Scott's trauma by adding social humiliation to personal devastation. Their presence also serves meta-textual function, representing adult witnesses who observe child-on-child psychological torture without intervening, mirroring how South Park's adult characters consistently fail to recognize or address genuine harm occurring among the children. The episode's conclusion provides no redemption arc or consequence for Cartman's actions. He experiences pure triumph, having successfully destroyed another person psychologically while gaining social status and validation from his orchestration. The other children respond with impressed admiration rather than horror, suggesting that extreme cruelty earns respect when executed with sufficient planning and intelligence. This normalization of psychopathic behavior establishes that South Park's universe operates without meaningful moral framework where actions have appropriate consequences. The transformation this episode creates in the series cannot be overstated in its significance for establishing new tonal boundaries. Before Scott Tenorman, Cartman's evil manifested primarily through offensive language, casual cruelty, and self-centered behavior that remained within recognizable childhood antagonist territory. After this episode, he becomes a character capable of premeditated murder and psychological torture, fundamentally altering how viewers understand his threat level. The shift from annoying child to genuine monster changes the dynamic of every subsequent episode, as audiences now know Cartman possesses both capability and willingness to destroy lives permanently. The episode's lasting impact comes from its willingness to show that Cartman isn't just an offensive child, but a genuinely sociopathic entity capable of calculated cruelty that destroys lives permanently. The methodical nature of the revenge, the complete lack of remorse, and the triumphant conclusion all suggest that Cartman possesses antisocial personality disorder, characteristics severe enough to predict future violent escalation. The episode serves as origin point for understanding Cartman as South Park's true antagonist, a character whose presence creates constant threat of psychological or physical harm to everyone around him while operating within a community that consistently fails to recognize or address his pathology. While Scott Tenorman showed Cartman's capacity for individual psychological destruction, another early element explores how South Park treats death itself as casual background noise that masks deeper existential horror. Kenny McCormick's death cycle represents one of South Park's most disturbing explorations of existential horror disguised as running gag, where a child experiences hundreds of painful deaths while retaining full memory of each trauma. The recurring joke begins in the pilot episode and continues through the first 5 seasons with Kenny dying in increasingly elaborate ways each episode. His muffled final words, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," becoming the series' most recognizable catchphrase. The deaths range from comparatively mundane accidents to impossibly violent scenarios involving explosions, crushing, burning, and dismemberment that treat child mortality as disposable punchline rather than tragedy. Each death receives brief acknowledgement from Stan and Kyle before the episode continues without consequence, establishing a pattern that suggests death itself holds no weight in South Park's universe. The comedic framing collapses entirely when the show reveals Kenny possesses full consciousness of his death cycle and resurrection pattern. Season 14's Mysterian Trilogy establishes that Kenny wakes in his bed after each death with complete memory of how he died, creating an existence where he experiences the physical agony and psychological terror of violent death repeatedly while being unable to communicate this suffering to anyone who would believe him. His parents' involvement with a Cthulhu cult explains the mechanism behind his immortality, connecting his curse to cosmic horror traditions where human suffering serves incomprehensible divine purposes. The explanation transforms the running gag retroactively into sustained torture, where Kenny has endured decades of painful deaths by the time the reveal occurs. The psychological impact manifests through Kenny's character as Mysterian, where he explicitly states that he's died so many times he's lost count and that his existence has become unbearable. His monologues reveal depression stemming from the impossibility of permanent death, where even suicide attempts result in resurrection that returns him to the same poverty and suffering he tried to escape. The episodes show him attempting to leverage his immortality for heroic purposes while struggling with the knowledge that his consciousness persists through experiences that should provide the mercy of oblivion. His attempts to protect his sister Karen from their family's dysfunction take on additional pathos when understood as efforts by someone who cannot escape his own suffering to prevent hers. The Cthulhu trilogy amplifies the horror by showing Kenny temporarily gaining control over an elder god, using Lovecraftian cosmic power to enact revenge on those who've wronged him, while struggling with the corruption that absolute power creates. His alliance with Cthulhu demonstrates how sustained trauma can warp even fundamentally good characters toward darkness when they're offered any means of asserting control over their powerless existence. The arc shows him willingly facilitating mass destruction and death because his own repeated deaths have desensitized him to mortality's significance, creating a psychology where other people's deaths matter less than his own endless suffering. The death cycle ultimately serves as South Park's longest meditation on consciousness and the psychological impossibility of true immortality when awareness persists through endless death. Kenny's curse represents hell disguised as continuity gag, transforming what audiences initially perceived as disposable comedy into revelation that a child has been tortured for entertainment across hundreds of episodes. Kenny's eternal suffering stems from his parents' cult involvement, but South Park's exploration of religious horror extends far beyond Lovecraftian references into territory where Christmas itself becomes vehicle for satanic worship. Woodland Critters. Christmas represents South Park's most extreme juxtaposition of innocent aesthetics with horrific content, transforming a traditional holiday tale into a narrative about blood sacrifice, forced birth, and demonic worship. The Season 8 Christmas special begins with Stan encountering adorable woodland animals who speak in high-pitched voices and exhibit characteristics associated with children's holiday programming. The critters include a squirrel, rabbit, fox, skunk, porcupine, and bear, all rendered in deliberately cute animation style that evokes classic Christmas specials like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Their initial behavior reinforces wholesome expectations as they explain their mission to protect a pregnant porcupine who will give birth to their savior on Christmas Day. The progressive revelation of the critter's true nature begins with subtle wrongness that escalates into explicit satanic horror. Stan agrees to help them by killing a mountain lion threatening the pregnant porcupine, only to discover after completing this task that the expected savior is actually the Antichrist, whose birth will bring about apocalyptic destruction. The critters celebrate this revelation with cheerful enthusiasm that contrasts sharply with the theological implications, maintaining their cute voices and innocent demeanor while describing plans for global annihilation and eternal darkness. Their joy at the approaching birth of ultimate evil creates cognitive dissonance between their presentation and their ideology. The blood orgy sequence represents perhaps the episode's most disturbing content through its combination of graphic violence and maintained cuteness. The critters engage in ritualistic sacrifice and sexual activity depicted through animation that makes the acts simultaneously cartoonish and viscerally disturbing. The scene's extended duration and detailed choreography suggest deliberate choice to maximize discomfort rather than brief shocking moment quickly passed. The critters' continued use of childlike voices during these acts amplifies the wrongness, creating audio-visual disconnect that prevents viewers from processing the content as either pure horror or pure comedy. Stan's attempts to stop the Antichrist's birth lead to the abortion subplot that depicts graphic medical procedure violence in animated form. He seeks help from the mountain lion, whose unborn cubs the critters have also impregnated with demon spawn, leading to a sequence where the mountain lion undergoes forced abortion of satanic fetuses. The procedure receives detailed visual representation, including blood, dismembered demonic fetal tissue, and the mountain lion's physical trauma. The graphic nature serves no narrative purpose beyond shock value, as the subplot could convey the same information without explicit imagery. The meta-reveal that Eric Cartman has been narrating this entire story as bedtime tale provides frame that suggests such extreme content could only originate from South Park's most psychologically damaged character. The framing device doesn't excuse or explain the preceding horror, but rather emphasizes that creating narratives combining childhood innocence with extreme violence requires fundamentally disturbed psychology. The episode ends without resolution to the Antichrist threat, leaving the horror uncontained and suggesting that Cartman's imagination produces suffering that persists beyond narrative conclusion. While Woodland Cry Tears use deliberate aesthetic contrast to disturb viewers, another recurring element demonstrates psychological horror through more sustained systematic patterns of abuse. Butterscotch represents South Park's most comprehensive exploration of childhood psychological abuse, where a genuinely innocent character experiences continuous trauma that would realistically create severe mental health disorders. His parents subject him to punishments that far exceed any reasonable disciplinary response, including extended groundings for incidents he didn't cause, physical confinement, and psychological manipulation that constitutes textbook gaslighting. The pattern establishes early when Butters receives punishment for situations entirely outside his control, teaching him that the world operates on arbitrary cruelty rather than logical cause and effect. His acceptance of these punishments without meaningful resistance demonstrates learned helplessness, developing in real time as he internalizes the belief that he deserves suffering regardless of his actual behavior. The systematic nature of the abuse becomes clear through its consistency across seasons and scenarios. Butters gets grounded when Cartman frames him for vandalism, when his parents discover evidence of his alter ego Professor Chaos, when he accidentally sees his father engaging in homosexual behavior at a bathhouse, and in countless other situations where he bears no legitimate responsibility. His father's enforcement of these punishments shows authoritarian parenting taken to abusive extremes, with Stephen Stotch exhibiting control and rage that suggest his own unresolved psychological issues manifesting as violence toward his son. The groundings involve complete social isolation, removal of privileges, and psychological pressure that would constitute child abuse under any reasonable legal standard. Butters' very own episode escalates the abuse from psychological to potentially lethal when his mother attempts to murder him after discovering her husband's homosexual encounters. Linda Stotch's decision to kill her son rather than confront her marital problems demonstrates catastrophic failure of maternal protective instinct, treating Butters as an expendable object whose existence matters less than maintaining social appearance. The episode depicts her driving him to a secluded location, attempting to drown him and only failing due to circumstantial intervention rather than change of heart. Butters' response shows complete cognitive disconnect as he tries to rationalize his mother's actions as somehow his fault, exhibiting the self-blame characteristic of abuse victims who cannot psychologically accept that their caretakers wish them harm. His transformation into Professor Chaos represents brief attempt at agency and rebellion against the powerlessness that defines his existence. The villain persona provides fantasy of control, where he can inflict minor inconveniences on a society that has consistently failed to protect him from his parents' abuse. The arc's comedy stems from the pathetic scale of his evil schemes, but this comedy masks the tragedy of a child so damaged by systematic abuse that even his rebellion manifests as harmless pranks rather than genuine threat or cry for help. Butters' continued optimism, despite comprehensive psychological damage, creates the most disturbing element of his character arc because it reflects how childhood trauma victims normalize their own abuse to maintain psychological stability. His cheerful demeanor and eagerness to please exist as survival mechanisms that prevent him from confronting the reality that his parents are fundamentally unsafe caregivers. The persistence of his innocence doesn't represent resilience, but rather demonstrates how effective psychological abuse can be at preventing victims from recognizing their own victimization. Butters' abuse stems from identifiable sources in his parents and social environment, but South Park's horror elements extend into genuinely supernatural territory where imaginary beings possess consciousness and suffer real consequences. Imagination Land represents South Park's most ambitious exploration of consciousness and suffering, where imaginary characters possess genuine awareness and experience real trauma when subjected to violence or death. The Season 11 trilogy begins with terrorists attacking an amusement park populated by every fictional character humanity has ever imagined, from Superman to Luke Skywalker to the woodland critters. The premise initially appears to function as meta-commentary on pop culture, but the narrative quickly establishes that these imaginary beings have conscious experience and feel pain when harmed. The terrorist attack results in mass casualties among characters who scream, bleed, and die in ways that demonstrate subjective suffering rather than simply ceasing to exist as narrative constructs. The philosophical implications become explicit when the Supreme Court must rule on whether imaginary things are real. Kyle's argument that imagination exists only in minds gets countered by evidence that Imagination Land operates a separate dimension where fictional beings live independent existences beyond their creator's control. The ruling establishes legal and metaphysical framework where imaginary suffering matters because consciousness creates moral weight regardless of ontological status. This decision forces uncomfortable questions about whether authors bear responsibility for torment inflicted on their creations and whether fictional death constitutes actual murder of conscious entities. The nuking of Imagination Land provides the trilogy's most disturbing sequence as the military solution to the terrorist threat involves destroying the entire realm and all beings within it. The imaginary character's awareness of their impending annihilation creates genocide scenario where thousands of conscious beings face obliteration because real-world authorities determine their existence poses unacceptable risk. Their pleas for mercy and attempts to escape demonstrate that they value their lives and fear death, establishing that they possess the same survival instinct and self-preservation drive as biological entities. The resolution suggests that imaginary beings can only be truly destroyed by being forgotten, meaning their continued existence depends on human memory and cultural relevance. This creates additional horror layer where beings must remain useful or entertaining to humanity to avoid slow death through obscurity. The trilogy's examination of consciousness suffering and the moral status of imagined entities operates as a genuine philosophical horror that questions the nature of reality and the ethics of creation. Imagination Land's philosophical horror operates on conceptual level, but South Park's most visceral exploration of identity and body modification presents medical procedures as literal mutilation that reduces serious personal transformation into gross-out spectacle. Mr. Garrison's surgical transformations represent South Park's most graphic body horror, depicting gender confirmation surgery and subsequent reversal with medical detail that treats identity exploration as physical mutilation. The Season 9 episode presents the surgery through extended sequence, showing graphic cutting, reconstruction, and blood that emphasizes the violence of bodily modification rather than the psychological significance of gender transition. The episode intercuts Garrison's procedure with Kyle undergoing negroplasty to become black and his father having surgery to become a dolphin, creating false equivalence that suggests gender confirmation surgery is comparable to impossible species transformation. The surgical sequences spare no detail in depicting flesh being cut, organs being removed, and tissue being restructured in ways that emphasize body horror over medical professionalism. The animation lingers on blood, exposed internal structures, and the violent physicality of surgical intervention, transforming what should be life-affirming medical care into visceral horror sequence. The dolphin and negroplasty surgeries serve as satirical commentary, but undermine that purpose by being presented with identical graphic detail, suggesting the episode treats all surgical body modification as equally absurd and violent. Mrs. Garrison's subsequent episodes dealing with the inability to have biological children and eventual reverse surgery compound the body horror while treating serious psychological issues as punchlines. The character's regret and decision to reverse the transition gets presented as validation that the original surgery was a mistake, ignoring that detransition remains statistically rare, and that Garrison's fictional experience doesn't reflect typical outcomes. The reverse surgery receives equally graphic depiction, showing the reconstruction process in detail that emphasizes destruction and rebuilding of flesh. The broader context reveals how South Park uses body modification as vehicle for gross-out comedy, regardless of real-world implications for transgender individuals seeking medical care. The graphic surgical depictions serve no purpose beyond audience discomfort and reinforce narratives that gender confirmation surgery represents mutilation rather than treatment. These surface-level elements represent South Park's most recognizable disturbing content that casual viewers reference and debate. Scott Tenorman established Cartman as psychological monster, capable of premeditated torture and murder, who feeds a child his own parents. Kenny's death cycle, revealed as existential torture where a child remembers every painful death across hundreds of episodes. Woodland Critters mixed cute aesthetics with blood orgies and forced demonic birth. Butters showcased systematic child abuse as comedy through parents who attempt murder and implement psychological torture as discipline. Imagination Land questioned consciousness and suffering by establishing that imaginary beings experience real pain when harmed. Garrison's surgeries turned gender confirmation into body horror through graphic surgical sequences that emphasized mutilation. These episodes demonstrate South Park's willingness to explore psychological boundary pushing disguised as crude satire, establishing the show's reputation for transforming shocking content into sustained explorations of trauma, violence, and suffering. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Shallow Waters now, Eric Cartman's Nazi sympathies represent one of South Park's most disturbing long-term character elements, where anti-Semitic ideology transforms from offensive jokes into the character's fundamental worldview, complete with Holocaust denial, Hitler worship, and systematic attempts to recreate final solution scenarios. The pattern establishes early with casual anti-Semitic remarks directed at Kyle Broflovsky that initially appeared to function as generic childhood antagonism between rivals. These early instances involve crude stereotypes and offensive language that fits within South Park's equal opportunity offense philosophy, where all groups receive mockery. The escalation occurs gradually as Cartman's statements reveal not mere edgy humor, but genuine ideological commitment to Nazi principles. The Passion of the Jew episode provides the clearest window into Cartman's Hitler worship through his fantasy sequence, where he imagines leading Nazi rallies and implementing fascist policies. The sequence depicts him in full Nazi regalia, delivering speeches in German to enthusiastic crowds, presenting this not as satire of extremism, but as Cartman's aspirational vision of ideal society. His excitement and joy during these fantasies demonstrate emotional connection to Nazi ideology rather than simple desire to offend. The episode's climax involves Cartman attempting to organize modern Holocaust by screening Mel Gibson's film to inspire anti-Semitic violence, showing that his beliefs motivate actual genocidal action attempts rather than remaining theoretical prejudice. The Ginger episode functions as Holocaust allegory, where Cartman attempts ethnic cleansing of red-haired children after learning they lack souls. His systematic approach mirrors Nazi methodology through propaganda, identification systems, and organized violence that escalates from discrimination to extermination planning. The episode reveals that Cartman himself has red hair under dye, creating ironic twist, but this revelation doesn't moderate his ideology or create self-awareness about the arbitrariness of his hatred. Instead, he simply redirects the genocide toward non-gingers once his own status changes, demonstrating that his commitment to systematic violence remains constant regardless of which group gets targeted. The consistent nature of Cartman's anti-Semitism across 20-plus seasons establishes it as core character trait rather than occasional plot device. He makes Holocaust jokes, denies historical atrocities, attempts to exterminate Jews through various schemes, and expresses genuine admiration for Hitler's methodology in episodes spanning decades of production. The show treats this as quirk that other characters tolerate rather than ideology requiring intervention, creating normalization where explicit Nazism exists within the friend group without prompting appropriate alarm or exclusion. The psychological profile suggested by Cartman's beliefs indicates radicalization that would typically trigger concern from educators, parents, and mental health professionals. His expressed ideology includes racial supremacy theory, conspiracy theories about Jewish control, and explicit statements supporting genocide. These beliefs don't manifest as abstract political positions but motivate repeated action attempts to harm or kill Jewish people. The combination of ideological commitment and willingness to act on violent beliefs would constitute serious warning signs requiring immediate intervention in any realistic scenario. The enablement by South Park's adult population demonstrates systemic failure to recognize or address childhood radicalization. Teachers, parents, and authority figures witness Cartman's statements and actions without implementing appropriate consequences or psychological evaluation. This passive acceptance normalizes Nazi ideology as acceptable childhood phase rather than recognizing it as genuine extremism requiring professional intervention. The pattern suggests that South Park's universe operates without functional child protective or educational systems capable of addressing ideological radicalization. The show's treatment of Cartman's Nazism as character quirk rather than crisis reflects broader satirical commentary, but creates problematic message about how communities should respond to childhood extremism. By presenting explicit Nazi ideology as source of comedy rather than horror, the episodes risk normalizing beliefs that should prompt immediate alarm. The consistent failure to address or reform Cartman's ideology across hundreds of episodes suggests that South Park views anti-Semitism as permanent character trait rather than belief system that could or should be challenged. While Cartman's Nazism represents ideological evil played as dark comedy, South Park explores child sexual abuse with frequency that reveals disturbing willingness to use pedophilia as punchline. South Park's treatment of child sexual abuse represents one of television's most troubling patterns, where pedophilia, grooming, and child prostitution appear repeatedly as comedy rather than trauma, normalizing abuse through satirical framing that undermines the psychological reality of victimization. The pattern begins in the first season and continues throughout the series, with multiple storylines involving teacher-student sexual relationships, child sex trafficking, and adult sexual interest in minors treated as humor rather than horror. The consistent deployment of child sexual abuse as plot device suggests systematic comfort with using childhood trauma for entertainment value regardless of real-world implications for survivors. Miss Stevenson's sexual relationship with Ike Broflovsky establishes the template for how South Park handles teacher-student abuse by treating it as positive experience for the child victim. The kindergarten teacher begins sexual relationship with Kyle's younger brother, and rather than depicting this as abuse requiring intervention, the episode presents it as a romantic relationship where Ike is the pursuer. Kyle's appropriate horror at discovering his brother is being molested gets mocked by other characters who insist Ike is lucky and that Kyle should celebrate rather than intervene. The episode's resolution involves the adults helping facilitate the relationship rather than stopping it, normalizing pedophilia when the perpetrator is an attractive female teacher. The distinction between male and female perpetrators receives explicit commentary when Kyle points out the hypocrisy of celebrating female teachers molesting male students while condemning male teachers doing the same. The show acknowledges this double standard but doesn't meaningfully challenge it, instead using the observation as setup for more jokes about how male children should enjoy sexual abuse from attractive women. The normalization of this particular abuse pattern reflects and reinforces real-world cultural attitudes that minimize harm when boys are victimized by women, preventing survivors from recognizing their experiences as abuse. NAMBLA. Episode content takes the pedophilia theme into explicitly criminal territory by depicting the North American Man-Boy Love Association attempting to have sex with Kenny and other children. The episode's comedy derives from Cartman accidentally joining the organization while looking for mature male friends, creating scenarios where he interacts with pedophiles without understanding their intentions. The predators appear as cartoon villains whose threat gets neutralized through slapstick rather than serious intervention, treating child molesters as bumbling antagonists rather than genuine danger. The episode concludes with speech defending Nambla's right to exist, presented ironically but still platforming pro-pedophilia arguments. Cartman's sophisticates handjob business represents perhaps the most disturbing casual deployment of child prostitution as comedy premise. The storyline involves Cartman recruiting other boys to provide sexual services to men for money, explicitly framing this as business venture rather than abuse. The episode treats child sex trafficking as entrepreneurial activity where Cartman's schemes happen to involve prostituting his peers, rather than acknowledging that facilitating child sexual exploitation constitutes serious crime with severe trauma consequences. The absence of lasting psychological impact on child victims across these storylines creates false narrative about abuse consequences. Children who experience sexual abuse in South Park appear in subsequent episodes without trauma, symptoms, therapy needs, or behavioral changes that would realistically result from such experiences. This erasure of consequences suggests that child sexual abuse doesn't create significant harm, directly contradicting clinical reality where CSA survivors experience elevated rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and complex trauma responses requiring extensive therapeutic intervention. The statistical reality of child sexual abuse trauma stands in stark contrast to South Park's comedic treatment. Research consistently demonstrates that CSA survivors experience severe and lasting psychological damage, including disrupted attachment patterns, difficulty with trust and intimacy, increased suicide risk, and complex PTSD symptoms requiring specialized trauma treatment. The show's depiction of abuse without consequences minimizes this reality and potentially impacts how viewers understand the severity of child sexual exploitation. Beyond sexual abuse, South Park's willingness to depict violence against children extends into scenarios that test whether any crime against minors remains too extreme for comedy. Casa Bonita represents one of South Park's most disturbing episodes when examined beyond its comedic framing, where Eric Cartman commits multiple felonies including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and psychological torture against Butters Stotch, creating trauma that would realistically require years of therapy. The Season 7 episode begins with Cartman's obsession with attending Kyle's birthday party at Casa Bonita, a restaurant featuring cliff diving and Mexican-themed entertainment. When Kyle invites Butters instead of Cartman as his plus one, Cartman's response escalates from disappointment to methodical planning of serious violent crime. The kidnapping plot demonstrates Cartman's strategic intelligence and complete lack of moral constraint as he constructs elaborate deception to remove Butters from availability. He convinces Butters that meteors are striking Earth and that nuclear apocalypse has begun, using fake news broadcasts and staged evidence to make the threat appear credible. His manipulation exploits Butters' trusting nature and tendency to believe authority figures, showing predatory understanding of psychological vulnerabilities. The deception requires sustained effort, including creating props, maintaining consistent narrative, and preventing Butters from accessing contradicting information. The false imprisonment phase involves Cartman locking Butters in an abandoned bomb shelter and maintaining the apocalypse deception for multiple days. Butters experiences genuine terror believing his family is dead and that he's among the last survivors of civilization-ending disaster. His psychological distress manifests through panic, crying, and desperate attempts to understand what's happening, all while Cartman prevents any contact with outside world that would reveal the truth. The extended duration of imprisonment transforms this from impulsive crime into sustained kidnapping, requiring ongoing active concealment. Butters' belief in the apocalypse creates existential terror beyond simple fear for physical safety. He processes grief for his supposedly dead parents, contemplates his own mortality in the wasteland Cartman has described, and experiences the psychological collapse that accompanies losing everyone he knows. His mental state deteriorates as the days pass without rescue, showing realistic trauma responses, including dissociation and acceptance of his new reality. The fact that his suffering stems from completely fabricated scenario doesn't diminish its psychological impact, since his experience of terror and loss remains genuine regardless of objective reality. Cartman's lack of remorse throughout the crime demonstrates his psychopathic characteristics as he views Butters' suffering as acceptable cost for attending a birthday party. He shows no concern for the trauma he's inflicting, no hesitation about the crime's severity, and no impulse to end the deception even as Butters' distress becomes obvious. His ability to maintain the elaborate lie while directly witnessing its psychological impact suggests profound empathy deficit and moral reasoning, so damaged that he genuinely cannot comprehend why torturing another child for trivial social gain is wrong. The legal reality of Cartman's actions involves multiple serious felonies carrying significant prison sentences if prosecuted in any functional justice system. Kidnapping charges, false imprisonment, child endangerment, and psychological abuse all constitute crimes reflecting recognition that such actions cause severe harm requiring serious consequences. The multi-day nature of the offense and the vulnerable status of the victim would typically result in enhanced penalties acknowledging the extreme nature of the crime. The episode's resolution provides no meaningful consequences as Cartman achieves his goal of attending Casa Bonita despite committing multiple violent felonies. Butters escapes and returns home without the incident receiving appropriate investigation or prosecution. The other children learn what Cartman did but respond with impressed admiration rather than horror, suggesting that successful crime execution earns social status regardless of moral depravity involved. This normalization treats serious violent crime as amusing scheme rather than behavior requiring immediate intervention. Cartman's crimes against individuals pale compared to his attempts at genocide that reveal systematic commitment to mass violence. Eric Cartman's genocide attempts represent South Park's most extreme character study, documenting multiple calculated efforts to exterminate entire populations based on racial, religious, or arbitrary characteristics, establishing the child protagonist as genuinely genocidal entity whose failures result only from incompetence rather than moral evolution. The pattern spans the entire series, with Cartman repeatedly attempting to organize mass killings that would result in thousands or millions of deaths if successfully executed. His motivation varies from ethnic hatred to personal convenience, but the consistent element involves willingness to eliminate entire groups of people through systematic violence. The Ginger Kids episode provides the clearest Holocaust recreation as Cartman organizes what he explicitly calls final solution to the ginger problem. After developing hatred for red-haired children based on false information about them lacking souls, he delivers speeches using Nazi rhetoric and symbolism to inspire violence against gingers. His methodology includes propaganda creating dehumanizing narratives, identification systems marking gingers for targeting, and organized groups prepared to execute systematic extermination. The episode's comedic twist, revealing that Cartman himself has red hair, doesn't moderate his genocidal impulse, but simply redirects it toward non-gingers, demonstrating that his commitment to mass murder remains constant regardless of target population. The Passion of the Jew episode documents Cartman's attempt to organize Holocaust against Jewish people by using Mel Gibson's film as recruitment tool for modern Nazi movement. His plan involves screening the movie repeatedly to inspire anti-Semitic violence, while personally organizing the infrastructure needed for genocide execution. He appears at a screening dressed in Nazi uniform and delivers speeches calling for Jewish extermination, showing that his ideology has progressed from casual prejudice to active recruitment for mass murder. The fact that this plot receives comedic treatment rather than horror response reflects the show's consistent failure to acknowledge the severity of genocidal ideology. The COVID special introduces Cartman's elderly extermination plot, where he deliberately attempts to spread coronavirus to senior citizens to eliminate the generation, preventing his preferred lifestyle. His methodology involves identifying vulnerable populations, understanding transmission vectors, and executing a plan designed to maximize casualties among specific age group. The scheme demonstrates that his genocidal tendencies extend beyond ideological targets to include anyone whose existence inconveniences him, revealing psychology where entire populations can be eliminated if their deaths serve his immediate interests. The Crack Baby Athletic Association storyline involves Cartman organizing exploitation of addicted infants for profit, treating vulnerable children as disposable resources to be used until destroyed. While not explicitly genocide, the systematic exploitation of an entire class of victims reflects similar moral calculations where certain populations can be harmed or killed without moral concern if economic benefit results. His willingness to profit from infant suffering shows the same empathy deficit that enables his mass violence attempts. The psychological profile emerging from these repeated genocide attempts indicates antisocial personality disorder, characteristics severe enough to predict escalating violence. Cartman exhibits complete lack of empathy for his intended victims, views mass murder as acceptable problem-solving strategy, shows no remorse for attempted killings, and demonstrates strategic intelligence sufficient to organize complex violent operations. The combination of these factors would trigger mandatory psychological evaluation and likely intervention by forensic mental health systems in any functional society. The adult's failure to intervene meaningfully despite witnessing Cartman's genocidal activities demonstrates systemic dysfunction enabling childhood radicalization. Teachers, parents, and authority figures observe his speeches calling for ethnic cleansing, witness his attempts to organize mass violence, and see his consistent pattern of escalating extremism without implementing consequences severe enough to prevent future attempts. This enabling pattern suggests that South Park's universe lacks functional institutions capable of recognizing or addressing genocidal ideology when it manifests in children. Each genocide attempt reveals Cartman's increasing sophistication in mass violence planning, as he learns from previous failures and develops more effective methodologies. His evolution from crude hate speech to organized recruitment to systematic planning shows trajectory consistent with actual genocidal actors, whose early attempts inform more successful later operations. The show's treatment of this progression as comedy, rather than horror, prevents recognition that the character represents genuine threat requiring immediate removal from society. While Cartman's evil manifests through attempted mass violence, South Park's treatment of mental illness reveals disturbing attitudes through how the show depicts clinical depression. Stan's depression arc represents South's. Park's most honest exploration of mental illness before betraying that honesty through magical reset, where genuine clinical depression and family dissolution get explored with surprising psychological accuracy before being dismissed as temporary phase rather than requiring ongoing treatment. The season 15 two-part episode begins with Stan's 10th birthday, triggering sudden perspective shift where everything literally appears and sounds like feces to him. The metaphor for depression's anhedonia receives visual representation through animation, showing Stan's world deteriorating into excrement, while other characters remain unaffected, establishing that his experience reflects internal psychological state rather than external reality change. The symptoms Stan exhibits match clinical depression criteria with remarkable accuracy. He experiences pervasive anhedonia where previously enjoyable activities provide no pleasure, shows social withdrawal and isolation from friends, exhibits irritability and emotional blunting, demonstrates difficulty concentrating, and loses interest in hobbies and relationships that previously defined his life. His description of how everything seems meaningless and disgusting captures the cognitive distortions characteristic of major depressive disorder, where depression convinces sufferers that life has always been and will always remain hopeless. The family dissolution subplot connects Stan's depression to environmental stressors as his parents' marriage collapses during the same period. Randy and Sharon's divorce proceedings coincide with Stan's symptom onset, creating ambiguity about whether the depression stems from biological factors, environmental trauma, or combination of both. The show depicts realistic family dysfunction patterns, including parental conflict affecting children, adults failing to prioritize their children's mental health during divorce, and the breakdown of family structure contributing to childhood psychological distress. Stan's attempts to cope involve self-medication with alcohol, establishing early substance abuse patterns that frequently co-occur with untreated depression. He discovers that drinking makes his world return to normal appearance, providing temporary relief from depression symptoms through chemical numbing. This pattern mirrors how untreated depression often leads to substance abuse, as sufferers seek any method to alleviate unbearable psychological pain. His willingness to continue drinking despite negative consequences shows how powerfully depression motivates escape-seeking behavior. The Fleetwood Mac needle drop during Stan's most severe depression moment provides the episode with emotional weight rarely seen in South Park. The use of landslide during scenes showing Stan's isolation and despair creates genuine pathos that treats his suffering seriously, rather than as setup for jokes. The musical choice acknowledges that depression constitutes real suffering worthy of empathetic response rather than mockery. The Asperger's resolution subplot provides both literal cure for Stan's depression and symbolic commentary on how society misdiagnoses and misunderstands mental illness. His depression symptoms get reinterpreted as Asperger's syndrome based on cynicism and literal-mindedness, leading to medication that supposedly treats the condition. The wordplay on Asperger's and revelation that the medication is alcohol creates satirical commentary on pharmaceutical treatment, while simultaneously suggesting that Stan's depression can be managed through substance use rather than requiring proper psychiatric care. The magical reset occurring between seasons undermines all preceding psychological accuracy by returning Stan to normal without explanation or acknowledgement of the depression arc. His symptoms simply disappear, his parents reunite, and his world returns to pre-depression state as though the entire experience was temporary aberration rather than mental health crisis requiring ongoing treatment. The reset suggests that clinical depression can resolve spontaneously without medication, therapy, or lifestyle changes, contradicting clinical reality where major depressive disorder typically requires professional intervention. The missed opportunity for representation becomes clear when considering how rarely animated series depict childhood depression with clinical accuracy. Stan's arc could have provided validation for young viewers experiencing similar symptoms while modeling appropriate help-seeking behavior and treatment. Instead, the reset sends message that depression is a temporary phase that resolves without intervention, potentially discouraging viewers from seeking help for their own mental health crises. Stan's depression received temporary acknowledgement before dismissal, but Kenny's poverty exists as constant background suffering that receives even less serious treatment despite equally severe psychological implications. Kenny McCormick's poverty represents South Park's longest exploration of childhood suffering through socioeconomic circumstances, where extreme poverty creates environment of parental neglect, insufficient nutrition, dangerous living conditions, and social exclusion that realistically would require Child Protective Services intervention. The McCormick family's economic situation exceeds typical working-class struggle into territory of severe deprivation, where basic needs for food, shelter, and safety remain consistently unmet. The family lives in a dilapidated house with visible structural damage, lacks reliable utilities, and experiences food insecurity severe enough that Kenny regularly attends school hungry. The depiction of the McCormick home environment reveals conditions constituting neglect by legal child welfare standards. The house shows severe disrepair with holes in walls, minimal furniture, and general squalor, suggesting that housing doesn't meet basic habitability requirements. Kenny's parents spend available money on alcohol and drugs rather than addressing their children's needs, exhibiting substance abuse patterns that impair their parenting capacity. The children lack adequate clothing, with Kenny's iconic parka serving as insufficient protection against cold, while symbolizing his family's inability to provide appropriate seasonal garments. Parental alcoholism and drug use create additional trauma beyond economic deprivation, as Kenny and his sister Karen witness adult dysfunction and face neglect resulting from their parents' addiction. The parents engage in domestic violence, pass out from substance use while children are present, and fail to provide emotional support or stable attachment figures. This combination of poverty and substance abuse creates what researchers term toxic stress, where multiple adversities compound to cause severe developmental harm. Kenny's chronic hunger appears repeatedly as comedy element, but reflects genuine food insecurity affecting millions of American children. He eats discarded food, begs for snacks from peers, and shows excitement about school lunch, suggesting it provides his most reliable meal. The physical and cognitive impacts of childhood malnutrition include stunted growth, difficulty concentrating, increased illness, and long-term health consequences that would realistically affect Kenny's development and academic performance. The social exclusion Kenny experiences due to poverty creates additional psychological harm through stigma and isolation. His peers mock his family's economic status, exclude him from activities requiring money, and treat him as lesser due to circumstances outside his control. This social marginalization compounds the direct harm of poverty by teaching Kenny that his worth as person is diminished by his family's financial situation. The psychological impact of poverty-based stigma includes shame, reduced self-esteem, and internalized beliefs about deserving poor treatment. Karen McCormick's situation reveals even worse conditions as Kenny's younger sister faces the same deprivation, with less ability to understand or cope with her circumstances. Kenny's protective behavior toward Karen shows his awareness that their home environment is dangerous and that their parents cannot provide adequate care. His alter ego, Mysterian's primary motivation, involves protecting Karen from their family's dysfunction, revealing that Kenny understands the severity of their situation even if other characters dismiss it as comedy. The absence of child protective services intervention, despite obvious neglect and deprivation, demonstrates systemic failure. Teachers, doctors, and community members witness signs of severe neglect, including inadequate clothing, chronic hunger, poor hygiene, and discussion of substance abuse in the home, yet no mandatory reporters file concerns or initiate welfare checks. This failure reflects both South Park's satirical universe and unfortunately realistic patterns where poverty-related neglect often goes unaddressed by overwhelmed child welfare systems. Kenny's parka functions as visual marker of his poverty while also serving protective purpose that reflects his need for barriers against hostile world. The orange hood obscures his face and muffles his speech, creating isolation that mirrors his social exclusion while providing psychological distance from his circumstances. His rare moments without the parka reveal vulnerability in the face of a child bearing emotional weight no child should carry. These Shallow Waters elements demonstrate South Park's willingness to explore sustained psychological horror through character dynamics rather than isolated shocking moments. Cartman's Nazism, as core character trait rather than occasional plot device, establishes him as genuinely radicalized rather than merely offensive. The normalization of pedophilia through comedy framing minimizes real trauma suffered by abuse survivors. Casa Bonita documents kidnapping and false imprisonment played as prank, rather than serious crime. Multiple genocide attempts reveal Cartman as systematically committed to mass violence. Stan's depression arc portrays clinical illness accurately before suggesting it resolves without treatment. Kenny's poverty creates sustained suffering treated as background joke. The tier reveals how South Park used systematic abuse, ideological extremism, mental illness, and socioeconomic trauma as sustained comedy elements rather than acknowledging their real psychological impact on developing children. Moving on to mid-tier, Brittany's new look represents one of South Park's most controversial and genuinely disturbing episodes, depicting pop star Britney Spears attempting suicide by shooting herself in the head, surviving with massive facial trauma, then being hunted by paparazzi and public for ritual harvest sacrifice while unable to communicate her suffering. The Season 12 episode aired during Britney Spears' highly publicized 2007-2008 mental health crisis, making the decision to depict her suicide attempt while she was actively experiencing real-world psychological breakdown ethically questionable at minimum. The episode's timing transforms it from typical South Park celebrity satire into participation in the actual public torture it claims to critique. The suicide attempt sequence depicts Britney entering a bathroom and shooting herself in the head with a shotgun, resulting in catastrophic facial injuries that destroy her jaw and much of her head while leaving her alive and conscious. The animation shows the immediate aftermath with graphic detail, including exposed bone, hanging flesh, and blood, emphasizing the body horror of suicide survival rather than treating the moment with appropriate gravity. Her inability to die despite the severity of her injuries creates additional horror as she remains conscious and aware, while unable to speak or communicate her continued desire for death. The survival with catastrophic injuries forces Brittany into a state where she can experience suffering but cannot articulate that suffering or advocate for her own needs. Her destroyed jaw prevents speech, reducing her communication to inarticulate sounds that others ignore or misinterpret. This forced silencing mirrors how media coverage of her real mental health crisis focused on spectacle rather than her humanity or suffering. The episode depicts her attempting to communicate through gestures and written notes, but characters dismiss or misunderstand her desperate attempts to convey that she wants to die. The paparazzi and public's response to her survival demonstrates society's bloodlust for celebrity destruction. As photographers swarm her hospital room, crowds gather to gawk at her injuries, and media outlets sensationalize her attempted suicide for ratings. The episode portrays this response with appropriate horror, showing the predatory nature of fame culture that treats vulnerable people as content to be consumed. The continued harassment prevents any possibility of recovery or privacy, ensuring that her suffering becomes public spectacle rather than private medical crisis. The ritual sacrifice revelation provides the episode's central metaphor as Stan and Kyle discover that American society periodically chooses celebrities for harvest sacrifice to ensure agricultural prosperity. The corn goddess mythology the episode invents suggests that Brittany's selection for sacrifice was predetermined, and that society's torture of her serves functional purpose within this system. The comparison to ancient harvest rituals implies that celebrity culture operates as modern human sacrifice, where chosen individuals must be destroyed to satisfy public bloodlust and maintain social order. The adult character's participation in the sacrifice demonstrates how systemic cruelty operates through collective action, where no individual bears full responsibility but all contribute to destructive outcome. Parents encourage their children to mock Brittany, photographers compete to capture her suffering, and ordinary citizens participate in public harassment while justifying their actions as entertainment consumption. The distributed nature of responsibility allows everyone to participate in driving someone toward death while claiming they personally did nothing wrong. Stan and Kyle's attempts to help Brittany escape the sacrifice reveal the impossibility of protecting individuals from systemic violence when entire society commits to their destruction. Their efforts to hide her, advocate for her humanity, and prevent her capture all fail because the sacrifice apparatus involves too many people with too much investment in her death. The episode shows that even well-meaning individuals cannot stop collective cruelty when it operates at scale. The prophetic quality of the episode becomes disturbing when considering Brittany's continued public struggles in subsequent years, particularly the conservatorship that stripped her autonomy and the Free Britney movement revealing extent of exploitation and control she experienced. The episode's depiction of society literally torturing her for entertainment proved uncomfortably accurate, as real events revealed how thoroughly her humanity had been disregarded by those profiting from her fame. The ethical questions surrounding depicting a real person's suicide attempt during their actual mental health crisis remain unresolved. While the episode attempts social commentary about celebrity culture's cruelty, it participates in that cruelty by using Brittany's real suffering as entertainment. The decision to animate her suicide and continued torture while she was actively experiencing public breakdown suggests that even South Park's satirical intentions don't excuse contributing to actual harm against vulnerable person. While Britney Spears suffered as real person depicted in cartoon form for commentary purposes, South Park's fictional woodland critters receive more comprehensive treatment across multiple appearances that establish complete mythology of absolute evil. The woodland critters represent South Park's most comprehensive exploration of innocence as mask for absolute evil, where cute forest animals practice blood sacrifice, forced birth, cannibalism, and demonic worship across multiple episodes that progressively reveal their systematic ideology of suffering. The critters' complete mythology spans from their introduction in the Christmas episode through their return in Imagination Land, establishing consistent characterization as beings whose every action serves to increase suffering and destruction in the world. Their persistence across multiple storylines suggests they represent fundamental force in South Park's universe rather than one-time horror element. The Critters' systematic evil operates through deliberate inversion of expectations, where symbols associated with childhood innocence and safety become vehicles for extreme violence. The squirrel, rabbit, fox, skunk, porcupine, and bear all speak with high-pitched, childlike voices and exhibit behaviors coded as adorable in typical children's media. This presentation creates cognitive dissonance when they discuss abortion, cannibalism, blood rituals, and apocalyptic destruction using the same cute mannerisms, forcing viewers to process extreme content through filter of violated innocence. The Antichrist birth plot establishes the Critters' theological framework where their religion centers on bringing about apocalyptic destruction through demonic birth. The pregnant porcupine carries Satan's spawn whose birth will trigger end times, making the Critters active participants in humanity's destruction rather than passive evil entities. Their cheerful enthusiasm about global annihilation reveals psychology where suffering and death constitute positive goods rather than unfortunate necessities. The theological implications suggest that the Critters worship destruction itself as divine principle. The blood orgy sequences across their appearances demonstrate that their violence serves both practical and ritualistic purposes. The sacrifices provide blood needed for their ceremonies while also functioning as worship expressions where killing becomes sacred act. The combination of religious devotion and sexual activity during violence creates association between pleasure, spirituality, and death that reflects genuine cultic practices. The animation depicts these scenes with sufficient detail to create genuine discomfort rather than allowing viewers to dismiss them as pure absurdity. Their return in Imagination Land establishes that the Critters exist as permanent fixtures of humanity's collective imagination, rather than being confined to a single episode. Their presence among other imaginary beings suggests that they represent real aspect of human psychological architecture, the capacity to imagine innocence corrupted into evil. Their behavior in Imagination Land remains consistent with their Christmas episode characterization, showing that evil constitutes their essential nature rather than context-dependent characteristic. The metatextual significance of Cartman creating the Critters provides additional layer of meaning as his imagination produces beings whose evil rivals his own. The fact that these creatures originate from Cartman's mind suggests that his psychology naturally generates entities devoted to suffering and destruction. The Critters function as externalized representations of Cartman's inner world, where cute facades mask systematic cruelty and where causing pain represents highest good. The abortion subplot's graphic nature serves to maximize the contrast between the Critters' presentation and their actions. The detailed depiction of the mountain lion's forced abortion includes blood, dismembered fetal tissue, and physical trauma that would be disturbing regardless of context, but becomes more so when perpetrated by cute forest animals. The Critters' clinical discussion of the procedure using their adorable voices creates audio-visual discord that prevents comfortable processing of the content. The Squirrels versus Critters war expands the mythology by establishing opposing forces in eternal conflict, where the squirrels serve as natural enemies, attempting to prevent Critters' evil plans. This good versus evil framework situates the Critters within larger cosmological struggle, elevating them from isolated threat to representatives of fundamental malevolent force. The Squirrels' consistent failure to stop the Critters suggests that evil in South Park's universe possesses inherent advantage over good. Stan's recurring trauma from encountering the Critters demonstrates that their evil creates lasting psychological impact rather than being forgotten between episodes. His horror and desperate attempts to prevent their plans show appropriate emotional response to encountering beings devoted to causing maximum suffering. The fact that Stan alone seems to recognize the Critters' true nature, while other characters remain oblivious, creates additional frustration and helplessness characteristic of horror narratives where protagonists cannot convince others of danger. The Critters represent South Park's purest distillation of its philosophy, where symbols of safety and innocence get revealed as vehicles for extreme suffering, forcing audiences to question whether any presentation of goodness can be trusted. The critters represent evil disguised as innocence, but South Park's Hell mythology reveals systematic torture that operates without disguise across an afterlife where suffering is explicit and eternal. South Park's Hell represents the series' most sustained world-building project beyond the town itself, depicting systematic eternal torture, demonic bureaucracy, and suffering hierarchies while simultaneously humanizing Satan as abuse victim, creating cognitive dissonance between cosmic horror and psychological complexity. The Hell mythology develops across numerous episodes spanning the series' entire run, establishing consistent rules and structures that make it feel like genuine setting rather than disposable joke location. The physical layout includes torture chambers, administrative offices, Satan's palace, and various specialized punishment zones designed for different categories of damned souls. The torture methods depicted range from traditional fire and brimstone imagery to more creative punishments tailored to individual sins or simply designed to maximize suffering. The animation shows beings burned, crushed, dismembered, and subjected to psychological torment that continues eternally without possibility of death or relief. The systematic nature of the torture suggests bureaucratic organization, where hell operates as efficient suffering production facility with specialized departments, ensuring that every damned soul receives appropriate eternal punishment. The population of hell includes historical figures like Hitler and serial killers, alongside ordinary people damned for relatively minor infractions, or simply for being born into wrong religion. The presence of Mormons in heaven creates running joke that they alone guessed correctly about theological truth, while followers of every other religion face damnation despite sincere faith and moral lives. This arbitrary damnation system creates theological horror, where honest mistakes about unprovable claims result in eternal torture. Satan's character development provides the most unusual element of hell's mythology, as he receives sympathetic characterization despite being literal devil. The series depicts him as abuse victim trapped in dysfunctional relationships, particularly his partnership with Saddam Hussein that exhibits classic domestic violence patterns. Satan's desire for love and validation humanizes him in ways that create genuine empathy, despite his role as hell's administrator and ultimate evil entity in Christian theology. The Saddam Hussein relationship storyline shows Satan as victim of manipulative partner who uses sex and emotional manipulation to control him despite Satan possessing vastly superior power. The dynamic inverts expected power structures where literal Satan becomes submissive to human dictator through psychological abuse tactics. The relationship includes emotional manipulation, public humiliation, sexual coercion, and cycles of idealization and devaluation, characteristic of abusive partnerships. The fact that this occurs in hell, while Satan runs eternal torture facility, creates bizarre juxtaposition between cosmic evil and intimate relationship trauma. Satan's various romantic relationships across the series establish pattern of seeking validation through partnerships while consistently choosing abusive or incompatible partners. His therapy sessions and attempts at self-improvement show genuine desire for emotional health and stable relationships despite his nature as embodiment of evil. These storylines treat Satan's psychological struggles with surprising seriousness while maintaining awareness of the absurdity inherent in sympathizing with the devil. The gay romance plotlines involving Satan receive generally positive treatment, as the show depicts his sexuality matter-of-factly without making his orientation the source of jokes. His relationships with male partners receive same examination as heterosexual relationships in series, focusing on relationship dynamics and compatibility rather than sexuality itself. This relatively progressive treatment contrasts with other aspects of South Park's LGBTQ representation. Satan's death and sacrifice in later seasons provides unexpected redemption arc where he gives his life to save others, suggesting that even ultimate evil can achieve heroism through self-sacrifice. His final act involves helping characters escape danger at cost of his own existence, demonstrating growth from self-centered abuse victim to someone capable of prioritizing others' welfare. The genuine emotional weight given to Satan's death and the character's mourning suggests that South Park's universe allows for redemption regardless of past evil. The theological implications of sympathetic Satan create interesting questions about the nature of evil and whether entities can transcend their fundamental purposes. If Satan can experience love, seek therapy, learn from mistakes, and ultimately sacrifice himself heroically, does he remain evil by nature, or has he transformed into something else? The show doesn't resolve these questions but presents them through Satan's characterization. Heaven's notable absence from most hell-focused episodes makes hell more disturbing, as the alternative to damnation receives minimal exploration. The rare glimpses of heaven suggest it operates as bureaucratic and boring compared to hell's dramatic intensity, implying that the binary choice facing souls involves eternal torture or eternal tedium without genuinely positive option. These mid-tier elements venture beyond individual shocking moments into sustained mythologies and real-world ethical violations. Britney Spears' episode depicted real person's suicide during her actual mental health crisis, participating in the public torture it claimed to critique. Woodland Critters established complete theology of corrupted innocence across multiple appearances. Hell's comprehensive world-building created systematic torture facility while humanizing Satan through abuse, victim characterization, and redemption arc. The tier demonstrates South Park's capacity for building sustained horror mythologies and crossing ethical boundaries around depicting real people's trauma. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Deep Waters. Eric Cartman represents television's most comprehensive depiction of childhood antisocial personality disorder, exhibiting every diagnostic criterion for psychopathy, including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, pathological lying, criminal versatility, shallow affect, and systematic cruelty that would realistically require forensic psychiatric intervention. The clinical criteria for antisocial personality disorder from the DSM-5 include pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15, but diagnosis can be considered in children when conduct disorder symptoms present early and persistently. Cartman's character demonstrates every criterion with such consistency across hundreds of episodes that he functions as textbook case study in developmental psychopathy. The lack of empathy manifests in Cartman's complete inability to understand or care about others' suffering, even when he directly causes that suffering. His responses to witnessing pain range from indifference to active pleasure, showing not just absence of empathy, but presence of sadistic enjoyment in others' distress. The Scott Tenorman revenge demonstrates this most clearly, as he orchestrates a child eating his own parents and responds to the resulting trauma with triumphant satisfaction rather than horror at what he's done. This response pattern repeats across every situation where his actions harm others, establishing that empathy deficit is stable characteristic rather than situational absence. The manipulative behavior appears in Cartman's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his strategic deployment of that understanding to exploit others. He identifies individual vulnerabilities, constructs elaborate deceptions targeting those weaknesses, and maintains complex lies over extended periods to achieve his goals. His manipulation of Butters involves understanding that Butters trusts authority and fears punishment, allowing Cartman to construct apocalypse scenario that Butters accepts without sufficient skepticism. This strategic psychological exploitation requires theory of mind sophisticated enough to model others' thought processes while lacking moral constraints against using that understanding for harm. The pathological lying extends beyond strategic deception into reflexive dishonesty, where Cartman lies even when truth would serve his interest better. His lies include denying obvious facts, creating elaborate false narratives, and maintaining contradictory stories without apparent distress at being caught in inconsistencies. The lying appears compulsive rather than purely instrumental, suggesting that dishonesty has become automatic response rather than calculated choice. His ability to lie without physiological stress responses that typically accompany deception indicates lack of anxiety about being caught that characterizes psychopathic personality structure. The criminal versatility appears in the range of Cartman's illegal activities spanning property crimes, violent crimes, fraud, kidnapping, attempted murder, and genocide attempts. His willingness to commit any crime serving his immediate interest demonstrates absence of moral constraints limiting behavior to legal actions. The diversity of crimes also shows adaptability and problem-solving capacity applied to illegal activities, characteristic of psychopathic offenders who view law as obstacle to navigate rather than moral framework to respect. The shallow effect manifests in Cartman's emotional responses that appear performative rather than genuinely felt. His expressions of emotion serve manipulative purposes or reflect immediate gratification, frustration, rather than deep feeling. His brief excitement about positive outcomes or rage at obstacles quickly passes without lasting emotional impact, suggesting that his emotional experience lacks depth and complexity, typical of normal psychological functioning. The exception involves his obsessive hatred of Kyle, but even this appears more like fixed ideation than genuine emotion. The systematic cruelty represents perhaps the most disturbing element, as Cartman doesn't just harm others incidentally while pursuing goals, but actively seeks opportunities to cause suffering. His jokes target vulnerable people. His schemes often involve inflicting pain as primary purpose rather than side effect, and he shows creativity in inventing new ways to torment others. The cruelty serves psychological need beyond practical benefit, suggesting sadistic personality traits where causing pain provides intrinsic satisfaction. The failure to learn from punishment appears in Cartman's consistent lack of behavior modification, despite experiencing negative consequences for his actions. He faces social rejection, physical assault, grounding, and various other punishments across episodes, but never adjusts his behavior to avoid future consequences. This inability to modify behavior based on punishment represents core psychopathic trait where learning from experience doesn't produce expected behavioral changes because the individual lacks motivation to avoid future punishment. The early conduct disorder indicators would be evident from Cartman's earliest appearances if the series operated in realistic timeline. His behavior in kindergarten-age episodes shows aggression, cruelty to animals, property destruction, and serious rule violations that would trigger clinical concern about conduct disorder. The progression from conduct disorder in childhood to antisocial personality disorder in adulthood represents typical developmental pathway for psychopathy, though Cartman's age complicates formal diagnosis. The controversy around diagnosing antisocial personality disorder in children stems from concerns about labeling youth, with diagnosis implying permanence and untreatability. However, research on callous, unemotional traits in children shows that early-onset conduct problems combined with empathy deficits predict adult psychopathy with significant accuracy. Cartman exhibits the stable pattern of symptoms across contexts and time that would override typical caution about childhood diagnosis. The treatment impossibility appears throughout the series as various attempts to modify Cartman's behavior through punishment, therapy, medication, or appeal to morality all fail completely. His brief moments of seeming reform always reveal themselves as manipulation rather than genuine change. This treatment resistance characterizes psychopathy, where the core personality structure resists modification through conventional therapeutic or correctional interventions. Whether the show endorses or critiques Cartman's psychopathy remains ambiguous, as his schemes succeed as often as they fail, and other characters continue associating with him despite his consistent cruelty. The lack of meaningful consequences and continued social inclusion suggests either that the show's universe normalizes psychopathy or that the satirical intent involves showing how communities enable dangerous individuals through passive acceptance of increasingly extreme behavior. While Cartman represents individual psychopathy, South Park's treatment of institutional abuse reveals how organizations systematically protect predators. South Park's treatment of Catholic Church sexual abuse represents the series' most sustained institutional critique, documenting systematic pedophilia, institutional cover-up, and victim dismissal across multiple episodes that transform from shock comedy into genuine investigation of how organizations protect abusers rather than victims. The pattern begins in Season 6 with Red Hot Catholic Love and continues through multiple subsequent episodes exploring how religious institutions respond to abuse revelations. The show's approach evolves from crude jokes about priest predation to more comprehensive examination of organizational structures enabling abuse. Red Hot Catholic Love establishes the basic premise through satirical depiction of Vatican's response to abuse scandal as being primarily concerned with public relations rather than victim welfare or preventing future abuse. The episode depicts priests as uniformly predatory, creating exaggerated portrayal that serves satirical purpose while potentially obscuring the reality that most clergy don't abuse children. The institutional response shown focuses on image management and legal liability reduction rather than moral reckoning with abuse that occurred under Church's authority and protection. The specific abuse depictions range from implied off-screen molestation to more direct references to child sexual assault. The show treats the abuse itself with varying levels of seriousness across episodes, sometimes depicting it as too common, occurrence receiving insufficient response, and other times using it as setup for jokes about hypocrisy and institutional dysfunction. The inconsistent treatment creates tonal confusion about whether the episodes primarily serve as social commentary or exploitation of serious trauma for comedy purposes. The institutional cover-up mechanisms receive detailed examination, showing how churches protected abusers through transfers to new parishes, confidential settlements with victims, and refusal to report crimes to law enforcement. These practices match documented real-world patterns where institutional priorities to protect reputation and avoid liability superseded duty to protect children. The show's depiction of these cover-up systems demonstrates understanding of how organizational evil operates through collective decisions that no individual feels fully responsible for. Victim perspectives remain largely absent from most Catholic abuse episodes, as the storylines focus on institutional response and community reactions rather than survivors' experiences. This absence reflects a broader pattern in South Park, where trauma victims receive minimal characterization and their suffering serves primarily as catalyst for other characters' storylines. The lack of developed victim characters means that abuse functions as abstract concept rather than personal devastation affecting real people. A Boy and a Priest from later seasons provides more nuanced exploration, showing character developing friendship with priest while navigating concerns about potential abuse. The episode treats the subject with more sensitivity than earlier crude depictions, while still maintaining South Park's satirical approach. The storyline examines how abuse scandals' prevalence creates suspicion around all clergy-child interactions, regardless of individual priests' actual behavior, showing how institutional evil damages both direct victims and broader community trust. The show's approach changes across different periods, reflecting both evolving social awareness about abuse and the creator's developing perspective. Early episodes treated clergy abuse as shocking revelation, suitable for outrageous comedy, while later episodes acknowledged the serious institutional failures involved. This evolution demonstrates responsiveness to cultural conversation, but doesn't retroactively fix earlier episodes' exploitation of serious trauma. The real-world scandal parallels become more explicit in later seasons as specific investigative journalism, like Boston Globe's Spotlight investigation, receives reference, and Catholic churches' documented patterns of protecting predators get incorporated into storylines. The show's willingness to address ongoing institutional crisis as it developed showed commitment to remaining culturally relevant even on difficult subjects. Whether satire serves survivors or exploits trauma remains contentious question, as some argue that public ridicule of churches' failures serves justice by preventing institutional evil from remaining hidden, while others contend that using child sexual abuse as comedy material minimizes trauma regardless of satirical intent. The absence of survivor voices in evaluating whether the episodes help or harm limits ability to assess their actual impact. Institutional abuse operates through systematic cover-up and organizational protection of predators, but South Park's exploration of addiction reveals different form of suffering, where individuals harm themselves with full awareness. Stan Marsh's alcoholism represents South Park's most psychologically accurate depiction of addiction as inherited family disease, where generational trauma, learned behavior, and systematic enablement create child who uses alcohol to cope with depression while his father models the same destructive patterns. The genetic component of addiction receives implicit acknowledgement through the parallel between Stan and Randy's drinking, suggesting biological vulnerability passed through family lines. The environmental factors appear equally significant as Stan grows up observing his father using alcohol for emotional regulation, social bonding, and escapism, providing modeling that normalizes substance use as coping mechanism. Randy's alcoholism functions as both comedy element and genuine character study of addiction's progression. His drinking begins as social activity but escalates into dependence, requiring daily consumption to maintain functioning. The show depicts his denial about the severity of his drinking, his inability to control consumption once started, continued use despite negative consequences, and the prioritization of drinking over responsibilities. These patterns match clinical addiction criteria even while being presented through comedic scenarios. Sharon's enablement patterns demonstrate how family systems maintain addiction through accommodation and excuse-making that allows addicted person to avoid facing consequences. She covers for Randy's drinking-related failures, makes excuses to others about his behavior, and adjusts family life around his substance use rather than insisting he seek treatment. This enabling behavior reflects common family dynamics where loved ones unconsciously support addiction by removing natural consequences that might motivate change. The Asperger's drinking subplot shows Stan discovering that alcohol temporarily relieves his depression by making his world appear normal rather than covered in excrement. This self-medication pattern represents common pathway to addiction, where substances that alleviate psychiatric symptoms create reinforcement cycle leading to dependence. Stan's willingness to drink despite being a child shows desperation for relief from unbearable psychological pain that overrides normal developmental barriers to substance use. Randy's Tegrity Farms marijuana subplot extends the addiction exploration into different substance while maintaining the same behavioral patterns. His transition from alcohol to marijuana represents substance substitution, where the drug changes but underlying addiction psychology persists. His insistence that marijuana doesn't count as addiction reflects denial characteristic of people with substance use disorders who rationalize their use as medicine, lifestyle choice, or harmless recreation despite obvious negative impacts. The genetic and environmental factors combine to create high risk for Stan, developing full addiction disorder as he ages. Research shows that children of alcoholic parents face significantly elevated risk for substance use disorders due to both inherited genetic vulnerability and learned behavior patterns. Stan's early experimentation with alcohol for emotional regulation suggests he's already developed psychological dependence pattern that typically precedes physical dependence. The show's treatment versus actual addiction treatment needs reveals gap between entertainment and clinical reality. Real addiction treatment involves acknowledging the problem, participating in evidence-based therapy, possibly medication-assisted treatment, peer support through programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, and addressing underlying mental health issues contributing to substance use. None of these interventions appear in Stan or Randy's storylines, as their drinking continues without meaningful attempt at recovery. The normalization of substance abuse in the Marsh family creates an environment where addiction remains invisible because everyone participates in similar patterns. When entire family uses substances problematically, no one occupies position to recognize the dysfunction or intervene. This systemic normalization prevents acknowledgement that treatment is needed and reinforces belief that substance use constitutes normal coping rather than disease requiring intervention. Addiction operates as slow self-destruction with full awareness, but South Park's body horror episodes reveal more immediate physical corruption. South Park's body horror episodes represent the series' most visceral explorations of physical corruption, where human bodies spontaneously combust, decay while conscious, transform into grotesque hybrids, or explode from internal pressure, creating genuine horror through detailed biological breakdown that surpasses typical cartoon violence. The animation medium paradoxically allows more extreme depictions than live action, because the distance created by cartoon aesthetics permits content that would be unwatchable if shown with actual human bodies. This enables South Park to depict biological processes and bodily destruction in detail that pushes boundaries of acceptable broadcast content. Spontaneous Combustion episode explores Randy's research into why people keep exploding without apparent cause, depicting multiple scenes of bodies igniting and bursting in graphic detail. The exploded bodies leave behind charred remains and biological material scattered across environments where deaths occurred. The investigation reveals that flatulence buildup causes internal pressure leading to combustion, creating pseudoscientific explanation for body horror premise. The episode's treatment of spontaneous human combustion as solvable mystery rather than supernatural phenomenon grounds the horror in bodily dysfunction rather than external threat. Kenny's decomposition while conscious appears in episodes where his death doesn't trigger immediate resurrection, forcing him to experience his body's decay process with full awareness. These sequences show progressive putrefaction, including discoloration, bloating, skin slippage, and other stages of decomposition depicted through animation that emphasizes the biological reality of death. Kenny's ability to perceive and react to his own decomposition creates additional psychological horror layer beyond the visual body horror elements. Cartman's various body transformations include obesity-related health crises, surgical alterations, and genetic modifications that change his physical form in grotesque ways. His weight fluctuations receive exaggerated depiction, showing skin stretching, fat distribution, and mobility limitations in ways that reduce body changes to comedy, while depicting them with enough detail to create discomfort. The medicalized transformations involve surgical sequences showing incisions, internal organs, and procedures that emphasize the violence inherent in bodily modification. The genetic engineering horror episodes, including the human centipede storyline, take body horror into territory of forced surgical fusion and technological violation of bodily autonomy. The centipede concept involves kidnapping, involuntary surgery connecting digestive systems between multiple people, and reduction of human beings to functional components of technology device. The premise operates as satire of technology company, terms of service agreements, but the body horror elements of forced surgical attachment and loss of bodily autonomy create genuine disturbing content regardless of satirical intent. Medical procedure graphic depictions appear frequently across episodes showing surgeries, injuries, and treatments with detail that emphasizes the violence and invasiveness of medical intervention. These sequences often use cutaway medical diagram style animation that shows internal body structures during procedures, creating educational aesthetic that somehow makes the violence more rather than less disturbing. The clinical presentation suggests scientific accuracy that amplifies body horror by making depicted processes feel real rather than fantastical. The animation medium's role in enabling extreme content becomes clear when considering that equivalent scenes with live actors would likely be unbroadcastable due to gore and biological detail. Animation creates aesthetic distance that allows viewers to process extreme content as cartoon violence even when the depicted biological processes receive detailed realistic treatment. This distance paradoxically permits more extreme content than realistic media, while potentially desensitizing audiences to actual bodily violence. Viewer discomfort versus desensitization represents ongoing tension as repeated exposure to body horror content can either increase sensitivity through accumulated distress or decrease sensitivity through habituation. South Park's frequent deployment of body horror across hundreds of episodes risks creating audience desensitization where extreme content becomes normalized rather than shocking. The escalation of body horror extremity across later seasons suggests that maintaining audience shock response requires increasingly graphic content as previous boundary violations become normalized. Physical body horror creates visceral response through biological destruction, but South Park's exploration of existential concepts reveals more abstract philosophical terror through its treatment of afterlife and damnation. South Park's complete afterlife mythology represents television's most comprehensive theological nihilism, where every religious system's heaven operates on arbitrary rules, most believers face damnation for trivial reasons, and the only certainty is suffering either through eternal torture or awareness that faith was misplaced. The show's theological framework establishes that afterlife exists, but that determining which religious system operates, it proves impossible for mortals making decisions during life. This uncertainty, combined with severe consequences for wrong choices, creates existential horror, where sincere belief and moral living provide no guarantee of positive afterlife outcome. Best Friends Forever establishes heaven and hell as organized forces engaged in cosmic war, where human souls serve as soldiers rather than passive recipients of reward or punishment. The episode shows heaven's angels, including Kenny, fighting against hell's demonic armies, revealing that afterlife involves continued conflict and danger rather than eternal peace. Kenny's role as heaven's chosen warrior suggests that even salvation doesn't provide safety from violence and suffering, merely relocates that suffering to cosmic battlefield. The Mormons being correct joke from earlier seasons creates theological horror through implication that only followers of one minor denomination achieve salvation, while billions of sincere believers from other faiths face damnation for honest mistakes about unprovable claims. The visual gag shows hell's gates with signs directing different religious groups to their eternal punishment, while small line of Mormons enters heaven, suggesting that probability of choosing correctly approaches zero. This framework makes afterlife into cosmic lottery, where faith, morality, and sincere spiritual seeking matter less than accidentally picking the one correct option from thousands of possibilities. Multiple contradictory afterlife depictions across episodes create additional uncertainty, as different storylines present incompatible visions of what happens after death. Some episodes show hell as organized bureaucracy with Satan administering torture facilities. Others depict it as chaotic realm of suffering. Still others suggest different afterlife systems for different people. These contradictions could represent intentional acknowledgement that afterlife remains fundamentally unknowable, or could simply reflect episodic television's lack of concern with canon consistency. Either interpretation reinforces theological nihilism, suggesting that truth about death remains inaccessible. Arbitrary damnation rules appear throughout afterlife episodes, showing people condemned for minor infractions, honest mistakes, or circumstances beyond their control. The suggestion that masturbation, premarital sex, or other common behaviors result in eternal torture creates system where nearly everyone faces damnation, regardless of overall moral character. The apparent disproportion between temporary earthly actions and infinite punishment duration reveals afterlife as fundamentally unjust system that punishes finite beings with infinite consequences. Purgatory and limbo spaces receive occasional mention, suggesting additional afterlife locations beyond binary heaven-hell system. These intermediate realms where souls await judgment or face temporary punishment add complexity while maintaining the fundamental uncertainty about afterlife's true nature. The existence of these spaces suggests that even death doesn't provide immediate resolution, as souls may face extended waiting periods or additional tests before reaching final destination. Death's character operates as personified entity managing human mortality without clear alignment to heaven or hell's interests. Death appears as neutral bureaucrat following rules beyond his control, suggesting that mortality itself operates independently of moral or theological systems. His characterization as working-class employee rather than supernatural force creates mundane quality to death that removes any transcendent meaning from mortality. The theological nihilism constitutes philosophical horror because it presents existence as fundamentally meaningless test, where correct answers remain unknowable and penalties for failure involve infinite suffering. The framework strips away religious comfort by suggesting that faith provides no reliable path to salvation, and that moral living offers no protection from damnation. The only certainty involves awareness that death leads to one of several varieties of suffering, whether through eternal torture, cosmic war, or grief about having chosen wrong belief system. Existential implications extend beyond afterlife to question whether life holds any objective meaning if post-death existence involves only suffering or oblivion. If sincere faith, moral character, and spiritual seeking provide no reliable path to positive outcome, then human striving for meaning appears futile. The show's theological framework suggests that cosmic order operates according to arbitrary rules that bear no relationship to human values or efforts, making existence into cruel joke where consciousness develops only to recognize its own meaninglessness. Theological horror operates on cosmic scale, examining universal existential questions, but South Park's treatment of individual mental illness reveals intimate psychological breakdown through specific character study. Tweak Tweak represents South Park's most disturbing portrayal of untreated childhood anxiety disorder, where a child exhibits severe panic symptoms, paranoid ideation, and physical distress while his parents unknowingly exacerbate his condition by serving methamphetamine-laced coffee, creating comedy built on a child's genuine psychological suffering. The character's consistent anxiety symptoms across episodes include trembling, hyperventilation, paranoid thoughts, catastrophic thinking patterns, inability to sleep, physical agitation, and vocal distress that match clinical criteria for generalized anxiety disorder and possibly panic disorder. The severity of his symptoms would require professional psychiatric evaluation and treatment in any realistic scenario. The Underpants Gnomes episode establishes Tweak's paranoia about creatures stealing his underwear, revealing that his anxiety manifests through both abstract worry and specific delusional thinking. The gnomes turn out to be real in typical South Park fashion, but Tweak's response shows how his anxiety creates hypervigilance where every fear receives constant attention and catastrophizing. His inability to distinguish between realistic and unrealistic threats reflects how anxiety disorders distort threat assessment, creating constant state of perceived danger. The methamphetamine coffee revelation provides disturbing explanation for Tweak's symptoms by showing that his parents have been unknowingly drugging him since early childhood. The Tweak parents' coffee shop serves beverages laced with methamphetamine that Richard and Mrs. Tweak believe provides energy and flavor, but actually induce stimulant effects. Tweak's constant consumption of this coffee means he's experiencing chronic methamphetamine intoxication, whose symptoms include trembling, paranoia, inability to sleep, and agitation identical to his anxiety presentation. The ambiguity about whether Tweak has underlying anxiety disorder exacerbated by stimulants or if all his symptoms stem from unwitting drugging creates additional horror. Craig and Tweak's relationship provides stabilizing influence as Craig's calm demeanor and genuine care help reduce Tweak's anxiety symptoms. The pairing in Creek episode and their continued relationship in later seasons shows Tweak experiencing fewer panic episodes when Craig is present, suggesting that secure attachment and emotional support can moderate anxiety symptoms. Their relationship dynamics demonstrate healthy patterns where Craig validates Tweak's feelings while helping him reality test catastrophic thoughts. The comedy derived from Tweak's anxiety stems from exaggerating his panic responses and verbal outbursts for laughs while depicting genuine distress symptoms. His high-pitched screaming and physical trembling become catchphrase-like character traits rather than being treated as symptoms requiring medical intervention. The consistent use of mental illness symptoms as comedy reduces serious psychological suffering to entertainment, teaching viewers that anxiety attacks constitute acceptable subject for mockery rather than empathy. Real anxiety disorder in children involves significant functional impairment affecting academic performance, social relationships, and daily activities. Tweak's anxiety would realistically prevent school attendance, make peer relationships impossible, and severely impact his family's quality of life. The show's treatment of his symptoms as manageable quirks rather than debilitating disability minimizes the real impact anxiety disorders have on children's development and well-being. Treatment absence represents perhaps the most disturbing element, as Tweak never receives psychiatric evaluation, therapy, or medication despite exhibiting severe symptoms across years. His parents remain oblivious to both his distress and their role in causing it through unwitting drugging. The school provides no counseling services or intervention despite having student exhibiting obvious mental health crisis. The complete absence of appropriate response from all adults in Tweak's life demonstrates systemic failure to recognize and address childhood mental illness. The methamphetamine drugging constitutes child abuse through negligent administration of controlled substance, even though his parents lack awareness of what they're doing. The fact that Tweak consumes stimulants daily from early childhood means his brain development has occurred under influence of methamphetamine, likely causing permanent neurological impacts. The child welfare implications of parents unknowingly drugging their child receive no exploration, as the revelation plays for comedy rather than horror. Tweak's anxiety ultimately represents how South Park finds entertainment in genuine childhood psychological suffering, treating diagnosable disorder as character quirk, while parents unknowingly administer controlled substances and no adults intervene despite obvious need for psychiatric care. These Deep Waters elements reveal South Park's most disturbing sustained explorations through comprehensive analysis rather than isolated shocking moments. Cartman's complete psychopathy profile documents every diagnostic criterion for antisocial personality disorder in childhood. Catholic Church Episodes Chronicle: Institutional Protection of Predators and Systematic Abuse Cover-Up. Stan's inherited alcoholism demonstrates addiction as family disease passed through generations. Body horror episodes depict biological corruption and human decay in graphic, animated detail. Theological nihilism establishes afterlife as arbitrary system ensuring suffering regardless of belief or morality. Tweak's untreated anxiety disorder, combined with unknowing methamphetamine drugging by parents, creates sustained psychological suffering played as comedy. The Deep Waters level demonstrates South Park's capacity for sustained horror operating through complete character studies, institutional critiques, and philosophical frameworks that challenge viewers to confront violence, mental illness, addiction, existential dread, and suffering disguised as crude satire. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These elements pushed boundaries while remaining officially aired content. The Lost Media and Censorship Iceberg explores what content crossed lines even South Park couldn't broadcast, revealing how institutional pressure, religious sensitivity, network standards, and genuine danger shaped what could be created. Next up, we've got the Lost Media and Censorship Iceberg. Without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with the surface level for this iceberg. The Super Best Friends episodes represent South Park's most famous censorship case, where depictions of Islamic prophet Muhammad led to network pulling, streaming removal, and ongoing unavailability that demonstrates religious sensitivity's power over creative expression. The original 2001 Super Best Friends episode depicted Muhammad as member of superhero team, including Jesus, Buddha, Moses, and other religious figures without controversy at initial airing. The episode showed Muhammad with standard powers and characterization consistent with other religious figures, treating him as one hero among many rather than emphasizing his Muslim significance. The 2006 Cartoon Wars two-part episode responded directly to Danish cartoon controversy by addressing whether showing Muhammad should be forbidden. The episodes examined media self-censorship when faced with threats, while depicting Muhammad in brief background appearances. The storyline's meta-commentary about fear-dictating content decisions proved prophetic, as subsequent events validated concerns about violent responses to Muhammad depictions. The 2010 episodes 200 and 201 attempted direct engagement with Muhammad's censorship by making him central character while acknowledging prohibition against depicting him. The solution involved showing Muhammad hidden inside bear mascot costume, creating compromise that allowed characters' presence without visual depiction. Comedy Central censored even this heavily modified approach by bleeping all references to Muhammad's name and removing the character entirely from streaming versions. Revolution Muslim's response included direct threats against South Park creators Matt Stone and Trey Parker, posting their home addresses online and making statements interpreted as encouraging violence. The threats referenced that Theo van Gogh, Dutch filmmaker critical of Islam, was murdered for his content, creating implicit suggestion that similar fate should befall South Park's creators. The specificity and credibility of threats transformed abstract concern into genuine danger, requiring security measures. Current unavailability status means Super Best Friends remains completely inaccessible through official channels, including Paramount Plus, HBO Max, Comedy Central website, and DVD releases. The episode exists only through fan-preserved copies circulating on unofficial sites, creating a situation where censorship is effectively complete for average viewers relying on legal content sources. The 200 and 201 episodes face similar unavailability with heavily censored versions as only official option. The distinction from other religious satire becomes stark when considering Jesus appears regularly, including in sexually explicit scenarios. Buddha snorts cocaine, Moses is depicted as giant floating dreidel, and Joseph Smith receives mocking portrayal in Book of Mormon musical without equivalent censorship or safety concerns. The differential treatment reveals that censorship results not from religious respect generally, but from specific credible threat of violence from certain groups. While Muhammad faced removal for safety concerns following credible threats against creators' lives, other content disappeared due to institutional pressure from wealthy organizations. Trapped in the Closet represents South Park's most sustained institutional conflict, where Scientology critique led to threats, restricted availability, and allegations of organized harassment campaigns against creators, demonstrating how powerful organizations can limit content without formal censorship. The Season 9 episode depicted Scientology's core beliefs, including the Xenu creation story, presented celebrity member Tom Cruise's alleged behavior, and showed church practices with satirical intent. The episode's closing featured "This is what Scientologists actually believe" caption during animated sequence describing Xenu narrative, emphasizing that the absurd-sounding content represented actual church teachings rather than exaggeration. Isaac Hayes' departure from voicing Chef followed the episode's airing, with conflicting accounts about whether he chose to leave or was pressured by Scientology to quit. Hayes was Scientologist, and his departure statement criticized religious intolerance, while Stone and Parker's response suggested church pressure influenced the decision. The loss of iconic character and voice actor demonstrated real professional consequences from religious organizations' displeasure. Tom Cruise's lawsuit threats never materialized into actual legal action, but created chilling effect through implicit danger of costly litigation from wealthy celebrity plaintiff. Reports suggested Cruise and his representatives contacted Paramount and Comedy Central expressing displeasure and implying legal response might follow. The threat's mere existence, regardless of legal merit, can influence programming decisions when networks calculate litigation costs against content value. Restricted streaming periods occurred where the episode faced removal from certain platforms or regions for extended periods without official explanation. The inconsistent availability suggested ongoing negotiations between Comedy Central, parent companies, and parties objecting to content. The episode's return to some platforms eventually occurred, but demonstrated that institutional pressure can create temporary censorship even without permanent removal. Scientology's documented harassment history includes well-established patterns of surveilling, investigating, and pressuring critics through tactics the church calls fair game. Former members describe institutional responses to criticism, including private investigators, frivolous lawsuits, and organized character destruction. This history means that creating content critical of Scientology involves accepting risk of becoming target for sophisticated harassment campaign. The episode's significance extends beyond single instance to broader questions about whether wealthy organizations can effectively censor through implied threats and institutional pressure, even when they lack legal authority to demand content removal. Scientology used institutional pressure rather than formal legal mechanisms, but network broadcast standards created more conventional censorship through regulatory compliance. South Park's network censorship patterns reveal television's actual boundaries through consistent audio bleeping, visual pixelation, and content modification that demonstrate even deliberately offensive programming, operates within regulatory framework, limiting genuinely extreme content. The FCC guidelines govern broadcast television's acceptable content through indecency standards prohibiting certain explicit sexual content, certain profanity during times children might watch, and content judged obscene by community standards. Cable networks like Comedy Central face fewer restrictions than broadcast television but still maintain standards and practices, departments evaluating content. The shit episode, It Hits the Fan, represented historic moment, as Comedy Central allowed the word shit to be broadcast uncensored 162 times in single episode. The network promoted this record-setting profanity as major event with counter-tracking each usage. The episode satirized the arbitrary nature of censorship by depicting shit becoming acceptable word causing society to collapse. The network's willingness to allow this specific word while continuing to bleep other profanity revealed that censorship operates according to negotiated boundaries rather than absolute standards. Visual censorship patterns include pixelation of nudity, modification of graphic violence, and editing of sexual content to meet broadcast standards. The show regularly depicts cartoon nudity that receives pixelation, creating comedy through obviousness of censorship, while technically complying with content restrictions. The pattern creates meta-commentary about censorship's arbitrary nature while allowing South Park to technically include content that would otherwise be prohibited. The evolution of standards across seasons shows gradual relaxation of what's permissible as cable television boundaries expanded, and South Park's established position provided negotiating leverage for controversial content. Early seasons faced more network notes requiring content modification, while later seasons received greater creative freedom. This evolution reflects both changing cultural standards and South Park's proven success, giving creators leverage to resist censorship. Streaming versus broadcast differences create situation where content airs with greater censorship on Comedy Central cable television, but appears less censored on streaming platforms with TVMA ratings. The dual versions mean viewers experience different episodes depending on viewing method. Streaming subscription model and age verification provides justification for presenting content unsuitable for broadcast television's wider audience. Uncensored DVD releases represent third version where content appears without network-mandated modifications, including restored profanity, uncensored nudity, and extended scenes cut for time. The existence of multiple versions demonstrates that South Park experienced significant censorship despite reputation for boundary pushing, with DVD releases revealing extent of broadcast modifications. Network censorship patterns ultimately reveal that South Park's offensive content operates within carefully maintained boundaries where explicit language faces consistent restriction, while graphic, animated violence passes without equivalent modification. The surface level reveals official censorship through religious sensitivity, removing Muhammad episodes permanently, institutional pressure from Scientology, affecting availability and causing talent departure, and network standards creating consistent audio and visual modifications. These elements demonstrate various censorship mechanisms, from credible violence threats to organizational influence to regulatory compliance. Moving on to shallow waters. Pre-streaming episode modifications represent South Park's least documented censorship layer, where early episodes underwent content removal or alteration for syndication and DVD release that created alternate versions predating digital platform concerns, making original broadcast versions increasingly rare. The syndication preparation process involved editing episodes to fit shorter time slots with commercial breaks, requiring content removal to meet running time requirements. These edits sometimes removed entire scenes or jokes, rather than simply trimming pauses, creating substantively different viewing experiences. The types of content removed for syndication focused on material deemed most controversial or offensive that might alienate advertisers or trigger complaints. References to specific products, the most extreme profanity, and certain sexual content faced removal more frequently than generic violence or crude humor. The pattern suggests that commercial and advertiser concerns drove editing decisions as much as content standards. DVD versus broadcast differences extended beyond simple commercial removal to include content restoration, alternate takes, and extended scenes that never aired on television. Early DVD releases promoted uncensored content as selling point, marketing the home video versions as representing creators' true vision, unconstrained by network censorship. The appeal to completist fans willing to purchase physical media to see unmodified content created revenue stream based explicitly on censorship's existence. Documentation challenges stem from lack of systematic preservation, comparing broadcast versions to subsequent releases. Most fans recorded episodes from television on VHS tapes that have since degraded or been discarded, while official archives may not preserve every broadcast iteration with all network-specific modifications. The result means that confirming specific changes requires comparing fan recordings to later official releases, process complicated by video quality differences and incomplete preservation. Collector recordings as preservation method means that amateur videotapes recorded by viewers during original broadcast represent only documentation of certain content versions. These recordings' variable quality and haphazard preservation means that systematic analysis of broadcast modifications remains difficult. Fan communities trade recordings and document known changes, but comprehensive catalog of all pre-streaming modifications likely cannot be compiled. The significance extends beyond academic interest in textual variations to questions about cultural preservation. When corporate owners can modify content retrospectively, if original broadcast versions exist only in degraded fan recordings while official platforms present modified versions as definitive texts, the historical record becomes unreliable and audiences cannot access content as originally presented. Syndication modifications affected older content through commercial concerns, but international censorship created entirely different viewing experiences based on geographic, location, and cultural standards. International censorship patterns reveal how South Park's offensive content translates across cultural boundaries, with different countries removing episodes, altering content, or banning the series entirely based on local, religious, political, and social sensitivities that create region-specific versions with significant content gaps. The country-specific ban documentation shows Middle Eastern nations where Islamic religious authority prohibits any depiction deemed disrespectful to religion, leading to complete series ban. Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia and Indonesia, have banned specific episodes or the entire series. China's censorship apparatus blocks South Park, completely following episodes critical of Chinese government, including banned in China. Religious content international sensitivity creates widest variation, as episodes depicting Muhammad face removal across Muslim-majority countries, while episodes mocking Christianity or other religions may air unmodified. The differential treatment reflects local religious demographics and legal prohibitions rather than universal content standards. Episodes dealing with religious themes face modification or removal when airing in regions where that religion holds significant cultural or political power. Political satire. Localization issues arise when episodes address international politics or foreign leaders in ways that violate censorship laws in affected countries. Episodes critical of Chinese government face automatic censorship in China and sometimes in countries with economic dependence on Chinese approval. Russian-focused episodes face restriction in Russia, particularly following increased government control over media. Violence versus language censorship. Differences show that many countries tolerate animated violence that would be unacceptable in live action while restricting profanity and sexual content more severely than American broadcasts. European countries often allow more explicit sexual content while restricting violence compared to American standards. These inversions mean that identical episode might face different modifications in different regions based on local priority about what content requires censorship. Complete series bans in Middle Eastern countries stem from religious content, sexual themes, and satirical treatment of topics considered sacred under Islamic law. The series' unavailability means that viewers in these regions can only access South Park through VPN services circumventing geographic restrictions or through pirated copies circulating on unofficial platforms. Fan access to censored content through VPN services and piracy creates parallel viewing experience, where determined audience members view complete uncensored content regardless of local restrictions. The ease of circumventing geographic blocks means that censorship effectiveness decreases for technologically capable viewers while maintaining restricted access for general population unfamiliar with workaround methods. International censorship creates fragmented global audience experiencing different versions of South Park based on national borders and cultural sensitivities, rather than unified series accessible to all viewers equally. International censorship operates through government and institutional mechanisms, but the most philosophically interesting restriction stems from creators' own evolving standards. Creator-initiated content suppression represents South Park's most philosophically interesting censorship layer, where Matt Stone and Trey Parker's own evolving standards lead to certain episodes being de-emphasized, regretted, or acknowledged as crossing lines even they now recognize as inappropriate. The known creator regrets include specific acknowledgments in interviews and commentary tracks, where Stone and Parker discuss content they wouldn't create today or recognize as having aged poorly. The Man-Bear-Pig climate change apology represents clearest creator reversal, as early episodes mocked Al Gore's climate activism by depicting him as paranoid about non-existent threat. Later episodes explicitly apologized by having characters admit they were wrong, and Man-Bear-Pig exists as real danger requiring serious response. The reversal acknowledged that original satire contributed to climate change denial by mocking accurate warnings as alarmist paranoia. The evolution of attitudes on trans issues appears through creators' statements, acknowledging that earlier trans-focused episodes, including Mr. Garrison's surgery episodes, may not reflect their current understanding. While they haven't explicitly disavowed specific content, interviews suggest awareness that satirical approach to gender identity issues involved mocking vulnerable population rather than challenging institutional power. Content they've said they wouldn't make now includes references in interviews to certain celebrity targeting and specific jokes they recognize as having crossed from satire into cruelty. The creator's growing wealth and mainstream acceptance may have moderated willingness to create content that feels like punching down against vulnerable targets rather than challenging powerful institutions. The difference between removal and acknowledgement becomes philosophically significant, as creators haven't demanded episode removal or made content unavailable, but instead publicly recognized flaws in past work. This approach allows content to remain accessible as historical artifact, while creators distance themselves from messages or approaches they now find problematic. Whether creative evolution constitutes censorship raises complex questions about artistic responsibility and intellectual honesty. If creators recognize that past work caused harm or promoted false information, does ethical obligation exist to limit that work's availability? Alternatively, does acknowledging mistakes while leaving content accessible represent a more honest approach that allows audiences to see artistic growth? These shallow water censorship elements reveal official and semi-official content restriction through syndication editing for commercial concerns, international censorship creating geographic variation in availability, and creator regrets representing self-imposed distance from past content. The tier demonstrates that censorship operates through multiple mechanisms beyond obvious bans, including commercial pressure, cultural differences, and artistic evolution. Moving on to mid-tier. South Park's deleted scenes archive represents vast creative iceberg beneath finished episodes, where cut content, alternate versions, and unused storylines reveal both creative evolution and material deemed too extreme even for broadcast, creating shadow version of the series visible only through DVD extras and bootleg recordings. The DVD commentary, Revelations, provide primary source for understanding what content was created, but didn't air, as Stone and Parker discuss specific cutscenes, abandoned plot directions, and material removed for time or standards concerns. Major cutscenes, documented through commentary and DVD extras, include alternate endings where different character received consequences or storylines resolved differently. Extended sequences showing more graphic violence or sexual content that exceeded broadcast standards, even with South Park's significant creative freedom. Character dialogue providing additional context or jokes that enhanced episodes but couldn't fit within time constraints. Alternate plot directions abandoned during production show creative process involved developing multiple story possibilities before selecting final version. Certain episodes began with completely different premises before writers pivoted to aired versions. Character arcs originally planned to span multiple episodes got compressed into single episode or abandoned entirely when writers developed more compelling alternatives. The distinction between time cuts and standards: cuts prove significant as time. Constraints force removal of content that creators wish to keep, while standards-based cuts involve network determination that content crossed acceptable boundaries. DVD release can restore time-cut material, but sometimes even home video platforms prohibit content that networks found too extreme, meaning some created content remains unavailable through any official channel. Most extreme cut content known includes references in commentary to jokes deemed too offensive or topical for even South Park's boundaries. These descriptions suggest material was created, animated, and then cut before network review, meaning creators' internal standards sometimes preempt network censorship. The self-censorship, based on judgment that certain content crossed lines, suggests awareness of boundaries even among creators known for pushing them. Preservation through fan communities occurs when work print versions, leaked animatics, or recorded convention panels showing cut content get captured and circulated among collectors. These unofficial preservation efforts mean that some cut content survives even when official releases exclude it, though quality and completeness vary significantly. The deleted content archive demonstrates that broadcast South Park represents curated version of more extreme creative vision, with cut material revealing creators developed content beyond what they ultimately deemed broadcastable. Deleted scenes represent intended but cut content, while earlier production stages reveal creative vision before practical or ethical constraints imposed modifications. South Park production. Material leaks reveal creative process at its rawest form, where storyboards, early scripts, and pre-animation documents show jokes before refinement, storylines before network review, and creative vision before practical or ethical boundaries impose necessary modifications. Storyboards provide visual blueprint for episodes showing shot composition, character actions, and visual gags before animation makes them permanent. The rough sketches often include notes about intended joke delivery or alternative visual approaches not used in final versions. Early script differences show dialogue and plot points before revision. Process refined them or removed material for various reasons. Script drafts preserve jokes that seem funny during writing but didn't work in performance. Story elements that created pacing problems or contradicted character consistency. References that dated too quickly or proved too controversial even for South Park standards. Pre-refinement joke content visible in leaked materials sometimes shows cruder or more extreme versions of jokes that aired in modified form. The evolution from initial conception to broadcast version reveals how collaborative production process involves multiple revision stages, where content gets shaped by writers, voice actors, animators, and network notes. Network note documentation, when available, shows Comedy Central's Standards and Practices Department, requesting specific changes including dialogue modification to reduce profanity intensity, scene cuts removing most extreme sexual or violent content, and timing changes to ensure commercial breaks occur at appropriate moments. The existence of network notes reveals that even South Park faces content restrictions despite reputation for creative freedom. How material surfaces varies, as some leaks occur through disgruntled employees or hackers, while other content releases intentionally through official behind-scenes features or authorized publications. The unauthorized leaks create legal and ethical complications, as production materials constitute intellectual property not intended for public release. The legal issues with leaks include copyright violations when materials get shared without authorization, potential contract breaches if employees or contractors leak materials they accessed through work, and complications for fans who view leaked content not knowing whether it was released legitimately. Most significant revealed changes documented through leaked materials include major plot revisions, character design alternatives that would have changed iconic appearances, and abandoned technical approaches to animation or music that would have created different aesthetic for the series. Production leaks provide unauthorized glimpse into creative process before network standards, time constraints, and ethical considerations shape final content, revealing that South Park's offensive broadcast versions represent significantly toned-down iterations of initial creative impulses. Production documents show creative evolution before broadcast, but the original pilot represents earliest iteration before network involvement shaped the series. South Park's original pilot represents the series' purest creative vision before network standards, budget increases, and audience expectations shaped the broadcast version, featuring primitive cardboard animation, cruder humor, and content that established the show's willingness to offend without yet understanding commercial television boundaries. The Spirit of Christmas shorts existed in two versions, with the first created in 1992 and second in 1995, both featuring animated construction paper, cutouts in stop-motion style. Jesus vs. Santa. Original concept depicted the religious figures fighting physically over Christmas's true meaning, with violence level and religious irreverence that established tone for the series. The short concluded with Jesus and Santa reconciling and acknowledging that Christmas can include both religious and secular elements, message less cynical than typical South Park content but still irreverent toward religious figures. Primitive animation technique involved photographing construction paper cutouts frame by frame to create stop-motion effect. The limited animation meant characters moved stiffly and environments remained simple compared to later computer animation. The visual aesthetics crudeness became part of the show's charm and DIY punk ethos that distinguished it from polished mainstream animation. Content differences from broadcast television included simpler plots focused on single joke premises, more extreme profanity without network oversight requiring modification, and copyright infringing use of existing characters like Frosty the Snowman without legal clearance. The short's underground nature meant creators felt no constraints from commercial or legal considerations. How Comedy Central discovered the shorts involves them. Becoming viral sensations passed through early internet and VHS trading, where entertainment executives saw the 1995 version and recognized its potential as television series. The network commissioned South Park series based on the short's combination of crude animation, offensive humor, and satirical edge that suggested underserved audience for adult-oriented animation. Current availability means both Spirit of Christmas shorts exist in various qualities online through unofficial uploads, while official releases have included them as DVD extras. The shorts' continued circulation demonstrates their historical importance as origin point for billion-dollar franchise. The unreleased pilot material demonstrates South Park's evolution from viral underground animation to broadcast television required significant refinement, but the original shorts' crude cardboard aesthetic and unfiltered offensive content established creative DNA persisting through commercial sanitization. These mid-tier elements reveal creative process archaeology through deleted scenes, showing content creators wanted to include but couldn't. Production material leaks exposing pre-refinement creative vision, and original pilot representing purest form before commercial television constraints. The tier demonstrates that significant creative material exists beyond broadcast versions while revealing extent of modifications required for television distribution. Moving on to deep waters, fan preservation networks represent South Park's true archive, where bootleg recordings, unofficial downloads, and collector communities maintain censored episodes, removed content, and or original broadcast versions that official platforms have scrubbed, creating underground canon preserving content deemed too extreme for mainstream availability. The preservation methods include digital files shared through torrent sites and file sharing platforms, physical media collections of VHS recordings from original broadcasts, and streaming on unauthorized sites hosting content unavailable through legal channels. Specific content preserved exclusively through fan networks includes uncensored Muhammad episodes unavailable on any official platform, original broadcast versions of episodes later modified for streaming and syndication, and work print versions showing content before final editing removed material. The Super Best Friends episode's only availability comes through fan-preserved copies, as Comedy Central, Paramount Plus, and DVD releases exclude it entirely. Quality and authenticity challenges arise as fan recordings vary in video and audio fidelity depending on recording equipment and source. VHS tapes degrade over time, losing quality with each viewing and storage period. Digital files passed through multiple compression cycles lose fidelity, even while remaining watchable. The authentication difficulty means confirming that preserved version matches actual broadcast requires comparing multiple sources and checking against documented episode details. Legal gray areas exist, as distributing copyrighted content without authorization constitutes infringement regardless of preservation motivation. But downloading for personal use occupies murkier legal territory, with enforcement focused on large-scale distribution rather than individual viewers. The legal risk for preservationists varies by jurisdiction, with some countries enforcing copyright aggressively, while others rarely prosecute non-commercial infringement. Muhammad episode availability through fan networks represents most significant preservation case as official removal-created situation, where millions of fans who never saw original broadcasts cannot access episodes through any legal means. The fan preservation provides only access point for content that remains culturally significant but officially unavailable. Community documentation efforts include wikis, cataloging known censorship and modifications, forums where collectors discuss episode versions and share sources, and comparison projects creating detailed analyses of differences between versions. These fan-organized efforts provide documentation that official sources don't maintain or release publicly. Fan preservation demonstrates that censorship creates demand for unauthorized access, with unofficial networks becoming necessary archives maintaining South Park's complete history, including content that official platforms determined crosses acceptable boundaries for contemporary viewing. Fans preserve removed official content through dedication and technical skill, but the deepest layer involves material that never reached production stage or final broadcast form. South Park's abandoned episode concepts represent the series' most extreme creative impulses that never reached production, where mentioned storylines, rejected pitches, and briefly developed ideas reveal Comedy Central's actual boundaries through what even deliberately offensive programming couldn't broadcast. Known abandoned concepts appear occasionally in interviews, where creators mention ideas they developed but couldn't produce. Commentary tracks reference stories that seemed funny during pitch sessions but proved unworkable during development. Convention panels sometimes feature creators discussing most extreme ideas they've proposed. Network veto documentation exists rarely, as Comedy Central typically doesn't publicly discuss rejected content, but occasional reports from entertainment journalism suggest specific concepts faced network prohibition before production began. The vetoes sometimes involve content deemed too controversial for broadcast timing, material requiring budget beyond episode allocation, or premises requiring guest participation unavailable or unwilling to participate. Most extreme known pitches mentioned publicly include brief references to concepts involving real tragedies too soon after events occurred, celebrity targeting that would have created legal liability beyond acceptable risk, and premises requiring graphic content beyond even South Park's expansive boundaries. The specific details remain vague, as discussing rejected content creates public relations complications even when content was never produced. Why certain ideas couldn't proceed involves multiple factors, including network refusal to air content, crossing specific boundaries, creator judgment that premise wasn't funny enough to justify controversy, practical impossibility of producing concept within time and budget constraints and concerns about legal liability, or real-world consequences of airing certain content. The difference between couldn't and wouldn't prove significant, as some concepts faced explicit prohibition from network, while others were abandoned by creators, recognizing they shouldn't produce certain content regardless of permission. The self-censorship based on ethical or practical concerns demonstrates that creative process involves internal boundaries, even among creators known for pushing limits. Any development that occurred for abandoned concepts sometimes results in partial materials like preliminary scripts, character designs, or storyboards that never advance to full production. These fragments occasionally surface through leaks or get mentioned in behind-the-scenes materials. Abandoned concepts reveal South Park's boundaries exist not just in censored broadcast content, but in pre-production vetoes, where network standards, creator judgment, or practical impossibility prevented certain ideas from ever reaching animation stage. These Deep Waters elements expose underground preservation, filling gaps created by official censorship, phantom content that never progressed beyond concept stage, and mysterious international variants that may not exist beyond collective false memory. The tier reveals increasingly unverifiable territory where documentation meets speculation and preservation meets myth-making. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The Abyss. South Park Lost episode legends represent the series' deepest mythological layer, where persistent rumors claim certain episodes were filmed but destroyed, aired once then suppressed or completed, but deemed too extreme for any broadcast, creating phantom canon that exists only in unverified accounts, and creative speculation. Specific lost episode rumors include claims that certain episodes about real tragedies were produced immediately after events, but pulled before airing. Stories that early season episodes contained content so extreme that even Comedy Central destroyed masters to prevent accidental release. Legends about celebrity targeting episodes so defamatory that legal settlements required permanent suppression. Aired once claims face particular verification challenges as proving episode. Broadcast single time requires finding viewers who recorded that specific airing while explaining why no other recordings exist. The pre-internet era makes verification nearly impossible, as television viewing was ephemeral and recording was less common. The claims typically involve episodes allegedly pulled after initial broadcast due to viewer complaints or legal threats. Most persistent legends include the alleged 9/11 episode, supposedly produced immediately after attacks but deemed too insensitive to air, rumors about celebrity revenge episodes so vicious that subject threatened litigation, forcing permanent suppression, and stories about experimental episode using different animation style or narrative approach that creators decided didn't fit series and destroyed. Why these myths emerge involves combination of factors, including genuine knowledge that content was cut or abandoned, getting distorted through retelling, fan desire to believe more extreme content exists beyond what's aired, and hoax creators intentionally spreading false information for attention or amusement. The myths persist because absolute proof of non-existence is impossible, allowing legends to survive despite lack of supporting evidence. The difference between lost and simply unavailable proves crucial, as genuinely lost content would be permanently destroyed or irretrievable, while unavailable content exists but isn't accessible through current legal platforms. The Muhammad episodes are unavailable but not lost, as copies exist in network archives and fan preservation. Lost episodes would be content nobody can access because it no longer exists in any form. Creator responses to rumors range from explicit denials of specific legends to humorous acknowledgement that some rumors are more interesting than reality. Stone and Parker occasionally address lost episode claims in interviews, typically explaining that the truth is less dramatic than legend suggests. Lost episode legends demonstrate how censorship and restricted availability create demand for mythical content, with unverified rumors filling gaps in official documentation to create phantom South Park episodes that may never have existed but persist in collective fan imagination as ultimate forbidden content. Lost episode myths represent speculative territory at the boundary between fact and fiction, but the final abyss element involves genuinely disturbing real-world consequences. South Park's real-world violence consequences represent the iceberg's darkest bottom, where credible death threats, attempted attacks, and genuine danger to creators transformed theoretical censorship into practical safety concerns that permanently altered what content could be produced without risking human life. Specific threat incidents documented include Revolution Muslims' posting of Stone and Parker's home addresses, with implicit violence encouragement following 200 and 201 episodes. Death threats targeting Comedy Central employees, and executives demanding Muhammad episode removal. Credible threats requiring increased security at South Park studios and creators' residences. Revolution Muslim threats specifically referenced Theo Van Gogh's murder by Islamic extremist in 2004, after Van Gogh created film critical of Islam's treatment of women, creating clear implication that South Park creators could face similar fate. The organization posted creators' home addresses alongside information about Van Gogh's murder in content designed to inspire violence while maintaining plausible deniability about direct incitement. Any attempted violence remains difficult to verify publicly, as security incidents typically receive minimal disclosure to avoid encouraging copycat actions, but reports suggest that law enforcement took threats seriously enough to recommend security measures, and that at least one arrest occurred related to threats against creators. Security measures required include private security details, modified daily routines to reduce predictability, increased screening at South Park studios and Comedy Central offices, and law enforcement consultation about ongoing threat assessment. The security costs and lifestyle disruptions represent real burdens created by decision to create controversial content. How threats shaped content decisions appears most clearly in Muhammad episode removal and creators' statements that certain content isn't worth risking staff safety to produce. The calculation about whether satirical point justifies endangering people's lives represents ethical burden that most creative professionals never face. The self-censorship resulting from credible violence threat differs fundamentally from network standards or institutional pressure. Creators' public versus private stances may differ, as public statements often maintain defiance and commitment to free expression, while private decisions incorporate pragmatic assessment of actual danger. The tension between principled stance against censorship and practical concern for human safety creates no easy resolution. Other creators silenced by South Park threats include comedy writers, journalists, and satirists who decided that creating Islam-related content wasn't worth security risks after witnessing threats against Stone and Parker. The chilling effect extends beyond specific threatened creators to broader cultural conversation, as potential critics self-censor from awareness that extreme content might provoke violence. The real-world violence layer demonstrates that South Park's censorship history extends beyond network standards or corporate pressure into genuine physical danger territory, where threats against creators' lives transformed content decisions from artistic choices into literal survival calculations that permanently altered what animation could safely depict. That's it for the lost media and censorship iceberg, revealing how even deliberately offensive content faces multiple suppression layers, from network standards, international sensitivity, fan preservation networks maintaining censored content, phantom episodes existing as myths, and actual violence threats that transformed creative decisions into safety calculations. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.